Hey guys, what is up? SuperKmanrocks here, and we are here for my LEC Week 2 overview, analysis, and of course, at the end, my updated power rankings. Every single game in the LEC means so much now. We only have 3 weeks of action, and so you could be saying, Week 2, well, we're not that far in the season, still a lot of time for these teams to improve, and while that is true for a grander scale when it comes specifically to the winter split, this is the second to last week of the season. If a lot goes right for these teams, we could be seeing some teams qualify for playoffs right here, right now, or for top 8 at the very least right here, right now. So every game is incredibly important, and that means a lot of these games are going to be very interesting to cover. But before we jump into any of those, let me know down in the comment section below what your game of the week was. Which one were you looking forward to the most? I know I was looking forward to one particularly more than the others. I think a lot of you are going to agree with me with that top of the table clash, but a lot of really fun matches this week, so let me know down in the comment section below what team or what game you were most looking forward to seeing here in week number 2. But let's not waste too much time. Let's go ahead and jump right into it. We're going to be covering all 15 games here from week number 2, of course, starting off with day number 1. And kicking off our day number 1 games, we had a matchup between the 0-3 Astralis team and the 3-0 Team Vitality. And so, a little bit of a mismatch to start the week, and it went about as you would expect. Vitality was able to pick up the win, although I will say Astralis hung very tough in this game. The bot lane is still very good for this Astralis team. It's just not enough to actually win games against a good team like Vitality, who just have some incredible solo laners. It really is the difference between Vitality and pretty much every other team like around them in the standings is their solo laners are just going to win so ridiculously consistently, and that's kind of what happened in this game. Towards the beginning of the season, the narrative around Vitality was all Bo all the time. It was Bo on these aggressive picks. It was him taking skirmishes in the jungle. It was Perks and Photon pushing their waves and fighting 3v3 on top side. It was a ton of really proactive plays like that. However, in this beginning of week 2 game, while Bo was good in this game, this one was about the solo laners first and foremost. My player of the game here in game number 1 is going to go to Photon in the top lane. You might not see that in the 2, 3, and 5 scoreline on the Gnar, but some incredible plays coming out from him. Not only did he dominate the laning phase against Finn and against this Cassante, which we'll get into in a bit. This really shouldn't happen in any circumstance, but not only was he up like 50, 60 CS, basically the entire laning phase, but some of those engages towards the back half of the game, most specifically the last one that ended the game, absolutely sealed Vitality's fate as the winners of this game. Photon's ability to go in, to know exactly where he needs to be, and to set his teammates up to be essentially as proactive as they possibly can, it's just higher than almost any other top laner in the entire league. I was high on Photon going into the year, but even I didn't expect him to maybe just be the best top laner in the league, basically from moment 1. He does every part of the game well. He will destroy you in lane, he will destroy you out of lane. It doesn't really matter. He's just really solid. He's good on these carry picks. He's also really good on a tank like Gnar, an initiator, someone who's going to be able to set up plays for the rest of his team. So overall, really impressed with Photon. He has just been fantastic over the course of the beginning part of the season. But the other player that you have to talk about here for Vitality that has played really well over the beginning part of the year is, of course, Perks. Perks was my player of the week in week 1. I know a lot of people gave it to Bo. I thought Perks was a little bit more explosive, and that actually absolutely continues in this game. He destroys Dior in lane, always up, and that's not really super surprising in the Twisted Fate Syndra matchup. As long as Perks plays it right, he should be able to have prio in that lane rather easily, I would say. The TF is just not going to be able to trade at all with the Syndra, especially in laning phase, but so many mistakes from Astralis towards the back half of the game. I'll point out one now. You know, we'll get to Finn in a bit, but Finn ulting the Syndra at full health, and then the Syndra just using the ultimate to execute Finn just didn't really make a lot of sense, but you know, Perks did exactly what he needed to do. The damage coming out on that champion can be ridiculous when she is ahead, and I thought Perks actually just played it really solidly, right? He's going into a bad mid laner. He should be able to beat him, and he absolutely did. So big credit to the solo laners. They were the big kind of driving forces for Vitality, but of course everybody else on the team also playing well. It's just good to see that Vitality winning games isn't entirely predicated on Bo winning, right? They can win games in a lot of different ways. Photon can win, Perks can win, which I think is a really good sign. Obviously, I think this bot lane's going to be a little bit more weak side than maybe the top side will be, but it's still a good sign to see it. As for Astralis, on the other hand, good and bad coming out of this game for this team. Obviously, dropping to 0-4, not good. You don't really want to be in a position where you're sitting at 0-4, maybe 0-5, maybe 0-6 coming out of week 2, right? Because you only have to not be bottom 2 in order to make the next stage. And, sitting at 0-4, it's definitely not a great start for that. But they did have some positives. I do want to point out the bot lane here. Both Kabe and Jonghoon, I thought, played really, really well in this game. Kabe in particular on this Zeri, given a lot of responsibility in this comp. It's a lot of peel, it's TF, it's K'Sante. You got a lot of things in here that are supposed to kind of enable this Zeri to carry in the late game. And Kabe, for his credit, absolutely did. He looked really good in this game. I thought he was more explosive, more proactive than Neon was. However, Neon obviously playing weak side on that Caitlyn, not nearly going to be as dominant, but Kabe was more, I would say, proactive overall, just generally. Jonghoon on the Yuumi, something that he pulled out a little bit last year. The pick is just really strong, generally speaking. A lot of this is going to be on Kabe and his ability to position, his ability to fight and skirmish. And I thought Kabe actually played really well. It was the rest of the team that just didn't really have it today. Finn is a very easy choice for dead of the game. Just a ton of mistakes. Not only did he get absolutely rolled in the top lane matchup in the 1v1 in the solo lane, but his K'Sante play towards the back half of the game was just poor. Like I said, ulting the Syndra at full health, and then he just gets executed. Like, I don't know what he's doing there. In the Baron fight, him just going in and dying. Okay, sure. I do think it speaks to a grander problem for Astralis. Yes, I do think they have a little bit of a hand stiff. I've talked about how I don't think 113 and Dior are particularly great at their roles in particular, but I think the biggest problem that this team has is absolutely decision-making. It's absolutely macro decisions. Kabe and Jonghoon can win games for you in the bot lane if you give them the opportunity to, but standing outside of Baron Pit and just, like, waiting to try and 50-50 it, like, what is the play here? What is the point? I just don't understand. It feels like you're taking such a giant risk for absolutely no reason at all, and I don't get it. There are so many different mistakes that Astralis makes over the course of a game that I think actively hurt their chance of winning. You can look at this game and you can see that it's 10-11, and the gold difference really wasn't that massive. Vitality was definitely in control, but Astralis should have been able to keep in this game. I think there's a different world in which Astralis maybe makes some better decisions throughout the game, and they're actually looking at a surprise win here, but unfortunately, Astralis just didn't come in with their head to the ground in this one, and they made a lot of small mistakes. Finn and Dior in particular just kind of bled out over the course of the game. Pretty much the entirety of the Vitality gold lead was through top and mid, and so that's always going to be a problem for Astralis. Finn looks really bad to start the year off. This very much looks like end-of-year Finn from Excel last year rather than like mid-year Finn, where he looked kind of okay. And then 113 and Dior are still problematic. If you want to find a positive on this team, I do think you can, because Kabe and Jonghoon continue to be good, just like they were last year, but I certainly don't think they are good enough to be able to carry Astralis to more wins than they're maybe anticipating. There are a couple other bot lanes that are on, questionable teams that have carried their teams to some wins. I'm looking at the BDS bot lane in particular, but I just don't think Astralis' bot lane is quite there right now. They're good, but they're not quite good enough to stop the brainless decisions that the rest of this team is making it. So I expect they're going to continue to struggle. They very much look like the worst team in the entire league, and I don't think there are going to be a lot of people challenging me on that. As for Vitality, very good win. This top side looks impenetrable. Photon, Bow, and Perks look legitimately unstoppable to start the year. It's going to be really interesting to see where they go throughout the rest of the split and throughout the rest of the year just in general. If they can keep up this pace, they are going to be the best team in Europe. Obviously, we've got a big top of the table clash as the week goes on, but for now, they look unbelievable, and I think for a lot of European fans, you're really hoping that Vitality can keep this up for the rest of the year. Moving on to our second game here of day number 1, we certainly had one that I was excited to talk about. Two teams that are really trying to prove that they belong in the upper echelon, because it is pretty wide open right now. We had a matchup between Fnatic and Team BDS, and you know what? Team BDS was actually able to pick up a massive victory here over Fnatic, who continues to look disjointed at the best of times to start off the year. But before we jump into Fnatic in general, let's talk about BDS, and let's talk about how good they have looked comparatively to their expectations. Now, watching this game, you are going to see one congruent theme, one congruent through line throughout the entire thing, and that's the pressure on the top side. That has created so much for BDS over the course of their first few games, even in week 1 where, yeah, they were 1-2, but honestly, they should have been 2-1. A lot of the pressure that they were able to create on both top and bot lane, in particular, early on in laning phases has allowed the jungle mid a little bit more freedom to play a little bit, more aggressive and kind of get away with some of the plays that they maybe normally wouldn't be able to. Now, that was absolutely the case in game number 4 here for them. I'm not going to try and sugarcoat it. That is basically exactly what happened. Adam absolutely dumpstered Wunder in the top lane, and I think that really unlocked a lot of opportunities for BDS. He gets to play his Olaf, and not only is he absolutely dominant in the laning phase, able to solo kill Wunder multiple times, able to fight him, able to generate this ridiculous lead, but later in the game, he's also able to translate that Olaf advantage into a very big problem for this Fnatic team. Obviously, not being able to be CC'd against this comp in particular. That means Cassante is really not all that relevant. I mean, Viego's not really going to be able to do anything to you. Azir can't ult you away. Ashe can't arrow you. You really can't, you just take everything, right? So, the Olaf here getting super far ahead was really problematic for Fnatic in general, and Adam played it ridiculously well. A very easy choice for player of the game here. I was very high on Adam going into the year. I think a lot of people were questioning why I ranked so high in terms of my top laners. I think I had him at number 6 going into the year, and that's because I said there aren't really a lot of top laners that I feel as comfortable saying can just straight up win you games quite like Adam can. Yes, he's going to be a little bit hit or miss, but for the most part, I think he was going to hit for this BDS team, and he was going to be the most explosive player, and that has absolutely been true through the first couple of games that they have played. He has genuinely been terrific. He's not the only one who's been terrific. Big credit to this bot lane. I've hyped them up all year long so far. Crownie and Labrov have far exceeded any expectations I could have had for them. It is really good to see them come back and, both of them be relatively high level in terms of what they've been able to perform on early on in the season. I hope that continues. If you can have your top lane and your bot lane pushing forward like this as consistently as BDS does, they're going to be a very scary team to actually have to deal with, even for some of the better teams in the league. Jungle mid still a little bit up in the air. This was a very good game for them, especially Nuke, who I do think has been playing better over the course of this year than he has really at any point in his LEC career, but still, I want to see them go up against more consistent competition. As good as Razork and Humanoid are, they're maybe not the players that I would consider the pinnacle of consistency, especially in the regular season. And so generally speaking, BDS looking really solid, especially when Adam gets his picks up in the top lane and when Crownie and Labrov can get ahead in the bot lane. For Fnatic, disaster. I mean, you're sitting here at 1-3. This is absolutely not how you wanted to start the year. You're really in a spot now where you're going to have to start winning, and you're going to have to start winning now in order to, feel a little bit more comfortable about not being bottom 2. It's really all that it's about. You can be okay being 7th or 8th, but you can't be okay being 9th or 10th right now, and so you gotta get your shit together, and it really does feel like we're in regular season mode for this Fnatic team. Wunder got absolutely run over in the top lane on the Cassante, and even more alarmingly, Humanoid. I mean, this was just another really terrible game from Humanoid. We saw a lot of these last year when we were talking about Fnatic, especially over the course of summer, but he had them in spring as well. Regular season Humanoid is a completely different animal to the Humanoid that we have gotten at Worlds or in the playoffs throughout his time in the LEC or in EU, just in general. He is not good in the regular season. There's really no other way to put it, and this game was a great example of that. He straight up lost to Nuke in lane, he was down CS, he was not winning. He made some really boneheaded plays. I think a lot of people are going to point out that one play in the mid lane where it looked like he thought he had ultimate up, but he just goes in and dies immediately with absolutely no backup. I could see the idea of maybe trying to get a pick onto, I believe it was Nuke in the mid lane. It could have been Adam as well, though. I don't actually remember trying to push him into Wunder, trying to push him into Reckless, but Humanoid ends up just inting it away, and those are the kinds of mistakes that you just can't make on a top team. He has been irrelevant at the best of times and bad at the worst of times to start the year here in 2023, and I hate to say it, but it's really not all that surprising to say that. This is exactly what he was in the regular season last year. He was a nuisance and a hindrance to the Fnatic team. He has the talent to be maybe the best mid laner in the entire region. He just needs to get his head locked in. He needs to get, some sort of confidence or something. I don't really know if it's a mental problem for him. I just know that it's not good. Whatever the result is, whatever the reason he is that gets him here, it's not working. The rest of the team really isn't all that good. Reckless and Rux play ridiculously safe. There's really not a lot they can do. Razork tries to make plays, but for the most part, there's really not a lot of plays to actually be made across the map, and like I said, the soul laners just kind of bled out here. And so, outlook-wise for both of these teams, Fnatic needs to get their shit into gear, right now, because it is starting to get concerning. Losing to BDS, we're going to see throughout the week, might not be the worst thing in the entire world, but You still don't want to be sitting here at 1-3, potentially 1-4, going into the final stretch of the regular season. You don't really have that many chances from here on out to prove that you can be a team that can survive this part of the schedule, and you really just have to survive. There really is no ifs, ands, or buts about it when it comes to Fnatic. Their goal now is just to survive, and so let's forget this idea of grandeur, and I know a lot of people are looking at top 4 for them going into the year. That's not where they're at right now. Right now, they're in a position where they need to hit top 8. I still think they can do it, but they do have a lot of question marks to try and overcome. As for BDS, they look fantastic. I mean, honestly, they really should be 3-1. They won the game versus Excel. They just lost it. You know what I mean? Their macro game lost it. But in terms of mechanics, in terms of hands, this team actually is really, really solid. Adam is ridiculously good in the top lane when he wins. Crownie and Lebrov are very solid in the bot lane. If Sheo and Nuke can just continue to be consistently okay presences in the jungle and mid part with how every other top team is just kind of in flux right now, not only in the LEC, but just in the world, this could genuinely be a top 4 team right now in the LEC. That is how ridiculous it is right now. But generally speaking, really good for BDS. If they can get their macro game on straight, this could be a very, very scary team, even for the rest of the year. Moving on to our third game here of day number 1. Certainly an interesting matchup that did not go the way I anticipated. We had a matchup between Koi and Team Heretics, and Heretics actually pick up a win here. Another upset. That's certainly not the last one that we're going to be talking about this week. Slight spoiler alert, but I don't imagine a lot of you don't know at this point, and so I'll just say that. But man, good win for Heretics. This is awesome to see. I think a lot of people were a little bit concerned with this roster after week 1, not because it wasn't working entirely, but because the question marks that the roster did have going into the year weren't exactly alleviated in any way. They were still there. The question marks definitely kind of came through in week 1. I think this game does a lot to help alleviate that from me going into the future, or at least it shows me the potential that this team has to be what we think it could have been all along. And so let's go ahead and talk about it. This was a really, really good macro game from Heretics. I think that is really the end-all, be-all of what I want to say. It's not the only thing they did right this game. Obviously, we can talk about Evi's mechanics on the Cassante and how absolutely brutal they are. But for me, my player of the game is going to go to Jankos, because I have very rarely seen a Graves control the game quite like Jankos was able to do against Koi in this one. This is certainly not a new thing for Jankos. He is historically fantastic against Rogue and against Malrang in particular, and so to see him continue that legacy here on Heretics, not particularly surprising, and for him to just control the game quite like this, kind of expecting Malrang to be exactly where he is basically every single time that he does something, it's incredibly impressive. This is a macro masterclass from Jankos, and this is what you were hoping you were going to get if you were Heretics going into the year here. Obviously, Jankos more so known, I would say, for his ability to help out the rest of his team rather than his ability to just out carry other junglers in the league. And I think this was a great example of what peak Jankos still looks like. I think he is absolutely still able to pull out performances like this and just dominate the game. So for me, Jankos, player of the game, a fantastic Graves game. We'll get to Malrang in a bit, but Jankos actually talked about this a bit on Euphoria over the past week, which is really cool, that Malrang is kind of notorious, I would say, a bit for skipping camps, delaying resources in order to try and make plays, and if those plays don't work, then it's kind of doomed, and Jankos definitely knew that. He took advantage of that, especially when he saw that Elise locked in, and so very good game from Jankos, but also you gotta give a big shout out to Evi. I mean, he just continues to dominate on this Cassante pick. At some point, I feel like you just have to ban it against Heretics. It is no longer an option. I mean, you're looking at the bans that Koi ended up doing. Ashe, Sedge, Ryze, are any of those really more important than the Cassante? I understand that the Ryze is a problematic pick, something that you really don't want to play against. I do understand that, but Sedge, I mean, okay. Ashe, I mean, really, like, they got Lucianami anyways. Like, really, what exactly are you afraid of here more than Evi's Cassante? Because he has just shown to be so much better on that champion than almost any other top laner in the entire league. Sagenda has certainly had his problems at the beginning of the year, and Evi was able to exploit that. I think a lot of people are going to give Evi player of the game, and I certainly don't disagree. He is dominant on this champion. I just thought Jankos had a little bit more of an impact on the game as a whole, but when you're talking just about, plays made on the map, I mean, that's Evi number one. It knocked it out of the park. Ruby was really good on the Azir. Jack, Spectra, and Mersa really bounced back. This is really where I felt like the team looked a lot different than week 1, where I was actually getting a little bit concerned about this bot lane. I was really high on Mersa last year and going into this year. Jack is somebody who's been hyped up a ton over the past 2 years or so, finally getting a shot here in the LEC. Both of them very much looked it in this game. They did a great job. Jack, for the most part, completely kept comp irrelevant in a lot of these team fights. And Mersa did a fantastic job of being able to enable the rest of the team. And so, generally speaking, I think Heretics did exactly what they were supposed to and exactly what they wanted to the entire game. A really, really good game from them overall. Koi, on the other hand, not so much. You're sitting at 2-2. It's not the worst thing in the world, obviously. You don't want this week to get out of control, but still not the worst week of all time. I'm gonna give dud of the game here to Malrang on the Elise because of what I talked about with Yankos. Malrang essentially did the Malrang thing, which is he invested so much into the early game that when it didn't go right, it was doomed. He could not come back. I talk about this pretty much every single Koi game on this channel, but Malrang is arguably the best jungler in the league from ahead, and he's arguably the worst jungler in the league from behind, and unfortunately in this game he got behind. He was bad. He was useless, and so Malrang is going to get my dud of the game. Obviously, him dying around the Elder Pit is not good. What is even worse is the team continuing to hit the Elder Dragon, which is just absurd. I'm going to talk about this play now. You get to the end of this game, the Elder Dragon is up. Malrang dies around Elder Pit. That is unfortunate, but Koi continues to try and fight for this Elder. Yankos just comes in and smites it because he's the only smite there. Of course he got it. And Koi just dies and loses the game. I don't really understand what the play was, but this just doesn't feel like the same team that they had last year, right? Like, you're returning 4 members. I get it, Segenda's like a difference, and Odo not being here I do think is problematic and certainly a noticeable difference for Koi overall, but to say that this team isn't used to playing together in these late game scenarios, I just don't think is true. I think they should have the tools to be able to make the right calls in situations like this, and right now they are just not doing that. A horrendous call. I'm not going to blame it on one person or the other, but whoever made it was wrong, quite frankly, and honestly, their hands are just not catching up. Comp was stellar last year. He was the best AD carry in Europe by a large margin. In my opinion, he has certainly not been that to start the year. In fact, I don't really think he's been all that good to start the year for Koi. I think a lot of their advantages have come from Larson in the mid lane, which it's not particularly surprising, but Larson continues to be the same exact playstyle that we always know that he has been. He's someone who's going to be relatively good in lane, but not someone who's hyper proactive in the early to mid part of the game, but he is arguably the best team fighter at that position in the region, and so, you know, that's great and all, but you need someone who's going to be able to take advantage of early games. Malrang, you know, obviously does a really good job of that, but he can be stopped by better junglers. Where exactly are your consistent wins coming from? It's actually going to be a little bit concerning for me on the side of Koi. Now, they still have a lot that they can do to kind of turn this around, but I didn't particularly like seeing this loss, mostly because I don't really feel super confident about Koi as a team right now, and I just need to see more in order to feel better about them. So, for now, Koi is just kind of sitting there as a team that has a lot of question marks, but should theoretically be able to figure it out before the end of the first part of this regular season. And then for Heretics, huge win here. This kind of shows a lot of the advantages that this team composition or this team construction has together. Evie can really take over that top side and can be a huge problem for a lot of these more, I don't want to say inexperienced, but less consistent top laners, people like Segenda, and Yankos is just probably the smartest jungler in the league still. His consistency is next level, and he's not going to be able to out-mechanic you, but he is going to be able to out-macro you, and he absolutely did that in this game. Jack Spectra in particular looked a lot better in team fights here. Honestly, Heretics just looked good in general, and you're really just hoping they're going to be able to keep this up through the rest of the year. Moving on to our 4th game here of day number 1, we had a matchup that I don't think a lot of people saw going in this direction, but I guess that kind of sums up this week in the LEC, huh? We had a matchup between G2 Esports and SK Gaming, and SK was able to pick up the massive victory for themselves. Unbelievable. No one really saw this coming, but that's kind of why I kind of saw it coming. This is just the LEC thing to do. Most specifically, this is the G2 Esports thing to do. I think I talked about this a bit in the week 1 review when they faced Astralis, I believe it was, and I was shocked that they actually were able to win the game because number 1 teams versus bottom teams in the LEC, they just don't win like that. They always lose. It's always an imperfect season for teams like that, but SK really being the beneficiary here, and honestly, they absolutely deserved it. What a performance from an SK Gaming team that did look very down for the most part throughout week 1. Yes, they were able to kind of turn it around through Exakick in their final game of week 1, but for the most part, over the course of that first week, they looked hapless. They looked like they could not accomplish much. For them to come out and honestly look really good against G2, this wasn't G2 throwing the game. This was SK pushing the pace, playing really fast, actually actively just outplaying G2. I think that is a really good look for SK Gaming. So let's talk about it. Let's talk about how they performed. Player of the game in this one, kind of up in the air. I actually think there are two really good options, but for me, it was kind of clear that it should have been Certus in the mid lane. Now, Certus is someone who I was actually really sold on by the end of last year. I thought he got a really bad reputation over the course of 2022, where he developed and grew a lot as a player. Came into the LEC really just as a LeBlanc player. Could play the Akali at a relatively good level as well, but again, very similar to some other players we talk about in other regions. Players like Closer in the LCK, players like Cream in the LPL. He was an assassin-oriented player in that mid lane, where it really was kind of his specialty. When he was on those champions, he looked a lot better than when he was on other champions. He grew a lot last year, most specifically with this Azir pick, which I think he pulled out a ton in 2022, and clearly he's been practicing on it going into 2023 as well. He goes up against the best mid laner, arguably the best player that the LEC has ever seen, and he just beats him. Like, it is straight up, he just plays better than him. He allows Caps to do nothing in this game on the Akali. His Azir positioning is literally perfect. He's perma-poking. He's perma-roaming for these skirmish plays around the jungle for Marcoon and for Irrelevant and for Exakick, and it's just such an impressive performance from a player that I do think has a pretty high upside at the LEC level. I'm not going to say that he's exactly hit it, but Certus is the kind of player where if you told me in a year we're going to be talking about him in the same level as some of the players like Humanoid, you know, a player like Niski, you know, in that same vein in terms of carry potential, I'm not going to be particularly surprised. He is an incredibly talented mid laner who has only shown to get better as he has played longer in the LEC. So a very deserved player of the game. You don't just beat Caps this hard in the mid lane and not get player of the game. And so for me, a very easy choice, but I think you could realistically also give this to Marcoon in the jungle. He was someone who I was very critical of in week 1. I think you could argue he was one of the worst players in all of LEC in week 1. A really good bounce back here. Gets on an early game champion. This is kind of the style that he was more comfortable on Excel over his time on that team, where he wanted to make these early skirmishes count. He wanted to make them matter and make them more important. He was someone who wanted to snowball the game out of control. He was never someone who just kind of wanted to farm up and then team fight towards the back half of the game. That really wasn't Marcoon's style, and so to see him on Elise here and to see him be so proactive, ganking a Scion in the top lane, which is a great pick. I love this into Cassante. Or even just Certus in the mid lane, getting him super far ahead. Marcoon made so many plays on the map that were super consequential towards the outcome of this game that this jungle mid duo really did turn around a lot of my perception on them just in this game by themselves. I know it's just one game, but Marcoon out-jungled Yike and Certus outplayed Caps, and that is incredibly impressive. Both of those things are huge accomplishments for this team to have, but both Irrelevant, or I guess all three of Irrelevant, Exakick, and DOS were also really good in this game. Exakick and DOS in particular, very stable on that bot side. You want to index at least a little bit into those late game team fights. You already have the Azir. You got the Scion that's going to infinitely scale. You've also got the Sivir here. If you can get to that 3-item Sivir, this game was basically over if you hit these late game team fights. Luckily for SK, they actually won the early game anyways because of how good Marcoon played on Elise, and so they were just in such a good spot to be able to carry a lot of that momentum into a pretty easy game win for them. As for G2 on the other side, some good and some bad. I don't think everybody on this team particularly played bad. I think Broken Blade on the Cassante was relatively impactful in this game. It's just very difficult to be super impactful. A lot of his kills came off of Scion, and really, what are you going to... I mean, how much are you gaining from killing Scion at the end of the day? The rest of the team, not so much. Caps really had no good targets to eliminate on the backline after he lost early. He had no way of getting on Certus because Certus was poking him out and spacing perfectly, so his only target was Marcoon for the most part in this game. Some on Exakick as well, but it's a lot more difficult to get onto Sivir as long as she has Spell Shield up, and so a lot of difficult plays being made here, or the game being made difficult for Caps, and I don't really think he was able to do much. And then the bot lane, I mean, completely folded here. Hansama and Mickey, as high as I was on them after week 1, where I thought that they were actually really impressive, they kind of showed that they were both a lot closer to what they were in 2021 than what they were in 2022. Hans certainly regressed, I would say, a bit in this game. This very much felt like a Team Liquid Hansama performance. He's going to get my dud of the game here. Just some missed positions, constantly being caught out by the Elise, by the Azir shuffle. Multiple moments where Hans was just not where he was supposed to be, and the damage, most specifically, was just not there. A lot on this comp, in terms of consistency, is going to be on the Varus, especially in the mid game, especially if the Graves is not winning, and the Graves was super far behind in this game. So the Varus had to step up. He had to be able to do that damage, and he just was not doing it. Hans Sama was very incapable in this game, and you have to see a better performance from him. But it wasn't just Hans. I thought Yike was really bad in this game, quite frankly. He's someone who I've been very high on going into the year. Obviously, a high potential prospect. I see a lot of people already calling him the best jungler in the LEC. I'm not going to jump the gun on that just yet. I still need to see it over the course of longer than 3 games. I know he's obviously a scrim god, but we've had a lot of scrim gods in the LEC in the past not exactly work out that same way. And so to see him kind of get beat by Marcoon, like Marcoon just played better than him this game, it does raise some questions. Is he exactly just the best jungler in the league right now? No brainer, right? There are a lot of good junglers in the LEC. It's going to be interesting to see what happens now that Yike is starting to get tested, I think, in that role. But I still have high hopes for this G2 team. This isn't some doom and gloom like, oh, they lost to SK, they must be a bad team. This is what G2 does. They play bad against bad teams. This is what they have always done, no matter how good the roster has been. This is pretty typical of this organization. And so I don't have a lot of worry that they're going to be able to turn it around. There are a couple things in here that do leave me a little bit more questionable. Hans and Yike in particular not having good games are definitely question marks that I just want to see more consistency out of them. Hans obviously coming off of a bad year, Yike being a rookie. The consistency that comes with playing in the LEC over a long period of time. I'm not worried about Broken Blade. I'm not worried about Caps, right? I have a feeling that they're going to be able to figure it out. But those two players, I just need to see them be able to kind of rebound from this kind of adversity, especially with how bad this game generally was for both of them. And so G2 I still have faith in, but maybe, some question marks at least arising for this unstoppable team. And then for SK Gaming, great win here, especially because it was through Marcoon and Certus. I think that gives me a lot of confidence that this team is going to continue to grow. It's just going to be interesting to see which one is real. Is this version of SK real, where they were able to take on one of the best teams in the league and genuinely look like they could hang in terms of mechanics? Or is the version that we saw in week 1 real, where they were getting absolutely blasted by basically everyone they played, except when they were able to sneak a win against Heretics later in the week? That's really going to be the big question. Is this the version of SK that we're going to get for the rest of the regular season? Because if it is, this actually looks really freaking good. Moving on to our final game here of day number 1 at the very least. It certainly was a matchup that I think a lot of people were interested to see how it would go, with especially how week 1 ended up going for both of these teams. We saw a matchup between Excel and the Mad Lions, and Mad picks up the win. This isn't particularly surprising with how these two teams had played at the start of the year. Mad looking significantly more cohesive than Excel, and I think a lot of people were really hoping, me included, that this Excel team would figure out whatever the problem was in week 1 and just not play the same at the very least. Like, I didn't need them to look like the best team in the league. I just needed to see them try to win games, and I don't know if I saw that in this game. I really don't know if I'm even on a path right now where I can think Excel is competitive in any way, shape, or form. They lucked into their only win of the season, and they haven't really looked all that good outside of that. So let's go ahead and talk about Mad first. We'll get to Excel later. Let's talk about Mad first. A really good comp, I would say, for Mad overall. A ton of scaling, a ton of opportunities in the mid game to be able to generate leads. And if you rely on your laners, if you can trust that your laners can win, then a lot of lanes where you can actively just shove and just kind of get to that part of the game where you're going to be stronger. And that's basically exactly what happened to Mad Lions in this game. They draft the Maokai, who's just able to control the jungle matchup so consistently over the Wukong. Like, as much as you want Wukong to go out and try to make some of these skirmish plays, especially in the mid game, try to fight these 3v3s, Maokai just shuts all of that down. There was literally nothing that you can do into that. And I think a big problem that they also ran into was that all 3 lanes lost, or for Mad Lions, all 3 lanes won, right? Like, all 3 of Mad Lions lanes, sorry, it's kind of hard to say, all 3 of them won pretty decisively, in my opinion, and that was certainly not what you wanted to see, although it's not particularly surprising. Azir into Akali is very Azir favored. We just saw that in the G2 SK game. Cassante into Gwen. While Gwen is a quote-unquote counter-pick matchup, I cannot stress this enough. Gwen has not beaten Cassante this year in any region that I have covered. It is actively ridiculous. I've talked about this in pretty much every video. I know I just talked about this in my LCK video a couple of days ago, but stop picking Gwen against Cassante. I get it. In theory, Gwen's a tank buster, Cassante's a tank. You should be able to outplay him, outskill him. It doesn't work right now. You're not winning. I legit think it's 0% in like 15 games. There is nobody who is making this work globally, and so big shock that lane lost. And then Sivir Lulu into Zeri Yuumi. Yes, Zeri Yuumi is going to be able to do, relatively good in the mid game, especially if the skirmishes do break out towards the bot side of the map. But Sivir is permanently going to push this lane in. Like, you have no prio on the side of Excel, and a lot of the late game heroics that Zeri should be able to pull off are kind of negated by Maokai, and are more so negated by the Sivir, who's just going to be able to out-damage her towards the back half of the game. And so generally speaking, I think draft was horrendous for Excel and great for Mad Lions, and they capitalized on it. Every single lane won, most specifically mid lane. Big credit to Niski. He's going to get the player of the game here. Completely outplayed VTO, who just looks inept right now on Excel. We'll get to him in a bit, but was very good not only at pushing the wave, but playing with his jungle. I think Elyoya and Niski have the best jungle mid synergy in the West. I don't even think it's really all that close. Those two players play at a level that other players just do not. And I think it really helps Mad Lions actively win a lot of these games. Obviously, Elyoya and Niski are fantastic players in their own right, but it's really good to see two players that I think actively do make each other better, which is what I think happens here. I think you could give player of the game to Elyoya in the jungle because he thoroughly dismantled Xerxes in that matchup, but he was playing Maokai. That does factor into it a bit. And also, I think Niski also did a great job with his macro plays of being able to take a champion like Azir that usually is the focal point of a lot of the plays being made and use that to spread the wealth, I think, to other lanes, most notably top lane here with Chasey. And so, generally, I was very impressed with what Mad Lions was able to do, but for the most part, I'm just very disappointed in what Excel is not able to do. This team just doesn't have any sort of fire. They don't have any sort of fight. They are passive. They are mental boomed. Like, I don't know what to say. This team looks lost. They look defeated, and that is not a good look. You have a lot of talented players on this team, players who have succeeded in the past. I see a lot of arguments and conversations surrounding 2022 Excel and like, oh, Patrick was overrated the whole time, and oh, I guess losing Mickey X was the problem. Obviously, I think those people didn't watch the LEC last year. That's about as clear as it can get, because anybody who watched this Excel team play in 2022 will know that Excel won in spite of Mickey X, and a lot of that was on Patrick. Patrick playing ridiculously well. I would say their best player was probably Marcoon over the course of 2023 or 2022, but Patrick was still relatively good as well. So to see him be so inept and so bad on this roster, I mean, he tried on the Zeri. There's just not much he can do. He just hasn't done anything at all this year. Targamas broke the assist record in the LEC last year. Yes, it was on a bot lane that did get dismantled at Worlds, but Targamas was easily the better part of that bot lane, in my opinion. He has been awful. VTO was an MVP last year in the spring, and that is, like, if we feel so far removed from that, I mean, he legit dragged Misfits across the finish line into playoffs, almost to Worlds, with how good he played. A very Prince-esque performance from VTO in the LEC last year. And, I mean, has he done anything? Like, he hasn't been particularly bad, but has he made a single play all year long? I don't know. Xerxes has been nothing. Odo was really good over the first week, but was horrendously bad in this game. Again, a losing matchup. Gwen just doesn't beat K'Sante. We've seen that globally. Not a lot beats K'Sante. Where exactly are you supposed to be getting your optimism and your upside here from on Excel? Everybody feels like they're just not invested. They are completely mentally checked out, and they show it. None of them are talking. None of them are smiling. They look completely mental boomed. I don't know, man. Xerxes is going to get done of the game because he got jungled circles around by Elyoya. He was always in the wrong place. He has continuously just been, like, 30 seconds behind to every single play that has happened to his team in every game that they have played, which is not what you want to see. It doesn't feel like he has any sort of read on the meta at all. It doesn't feel like he has any sort of presence on his opposing jungler at all. I don't know. Like, this entire team just feels like it lacks cohesion. You could give this to VTO, but, you know, blind picking a Kali when Azir is up. We just saw this in literally the game before this. I don't know why you did it. He was completely useless. I think you could give this to Odo for picking Gwen into K'Sante and then completely running it. There were a lot of options here for Excel, but for me, it's going to be Xerxes. I think the entire Excel team is done of the game, right? This team has no fight, no fire. They have to figure it out. I mean, there is nothing else to say. They are in danger, just like I said with Fnatic, of being a bottom 2 team in the league. And if you're bottom 2 with this roster, I mean, fire everyone. Literally everyone, because it is unacceptable. As for Mad Lions, great win. I mean, you look good. I feel like they're kind of the team right now that's capitalizing the most on a lot of these other mid to top tier teams just not being good. Teams like Fnatic, teams like Koi, teams like Excel here, just not being what we thought they would be. They're the ones that I think are really, like, skyrocketing up the standings because of it. That's not to say that I don't think they're a good team. I think they are a good team, but I think they're maybe a little bit of a stretch away from being a great team. I think Elyoya and Niski, like I said, are still fantastic players, and I think they have great synergy. Carzzy and Hilly have really worked well together, and it's good to see them play something a little bit more standard here in the bot lane and not completely try and get kills early on. Chasey's been solid in the top lane. I don't think he's some sort of superstar, but he's fine up there. I think Mad is a good team. Still to be seen whether or not they're going to be able to compete with teams like G2 and Vitality. Obviously, they got crushed by Vitality last week, so, you know, Mad's a good team. I'm just not exactly sure they're going to be one of these teams that genuinely competes for an LEC trophy. That's going to bring us to day 2 of week 2 action here, and we kicked off day 2 with a pretty interesting matchup that nobody thought was going to be interesting going into the year. We had Astralis taking on Team BDS, and BDS picks up another really strong victory. Astralis, unfortunately, can't quite beat this BDS team. They continue to have some major problems in particular positions, which we will get to, but BDS, man, they might actually be good, like kinda actually for real good, which is surprising. I don't think a lot of people, me included, expected this team to be able to hold their own on paper going into the year here in 2023, but they have really proven us all wrong. Another really good showing from this BDS team, and this was kind of a team effort, I would say, more so than some of the other ones where it felt like, oh, Adam had this great game, or Crownie in particular really showed up. This was very much a team effort from BDS, pretty much everybody playing their part incredibly well, and just generally being strong. I think player of the game was a little bit more difficult for me in this one, but I ended up landing on Sheo in the jungle, who I thought probably had one of his more complete games of the split. He's been up and down, I would say, overall for BDS, but honestly has mostly been good. I think that Shlatan comparison I made to him earlier in the season, or at the beginning of the season in my power rankings video, definitely landed. I think he's very similar to what Shlatan was in spring for that Misfits team last year, and that is a good thing. He is someone who is going to be positive if the rest of his team is performing, someone who can control tempo, someone who can make the right plays, but isn't necessarily going to dominate the game on his own. I think Sheo can kind of become that, or honestly really probably is that already, and I think that is a good sign for BDS. I think he picks up this Wukong here, goes into something like the Jarvan, where you really do want to generate that early lead. Obviously 1-1-3, kind of a particular champion pool, loves the Viego, loves the Jarvan. Those two picks definitely come to mind for that player. Sheo wanting to attack that, wanting to try and pressure him out early with something like the Wukong, but also adding just as equal of teamfight value towards the back half of the game if they did end up wanting to go that direction. Although, looking at BDS's comp, this is not really a comp that wants to 5v5 team fight towards the back half of the game. And so, Sheo really playing his role well. I thought he controlled the map well. I thought he played towards Nuke really well, which is something that I think he has certainly wanted to prioritize early on in the season. I think Crownie and Lebrov are great in the 2v2, and that has really opened up a lot of opportunities, I would say, for the rest of the map. Adam, definitely aggressive, certainly tried to make some plays in this game on the Jax. That's never going to be a problem. Mostly good plays, but definitely had some moments in this game where he was picked off in a side lane, you know, was opportunity for Kabe and Jonghoon to be able to try and get back into this. Not a bad, not the worst thing in the world. Obviously, he's a Jax. Sometimes he's going to be a little bit overextended. And also with Adam, he's going to try and take fights in situations where he might not necessarily be able to always win them consistently. But at the end of the day, they never really caused any problems for BDS. They were in such a commanding lead for a majority of this game that it didn't really matter. So, Sheo's my player of the game, but honestly, big shout out to Crownie and Lebrov, who continue to be one of the most underrated bot lanes in all of Europe right now. As for Astralis, another tough loss. You dropped to 0-5. This team just looks completely hapless right now. I think I said that earlier, but it kind of continued here. There's really no big changes for Astralis when it comes to how they played this versus how they played any of their games so far this season. It continues to be a problem to have these two solo laners in particular. Dior has been awful. Like, he has just been not playable at an LEC level, and that's okay. Sometimes you're just going to have a player that isn't quite there, but if this team does end up not making top 8, which it very much looks like they won't at this point, I expect Dior to be a pretty quick replacement here for Astralis. He just has not been able to compete at this level. He wasn't very good last year, although he showed signs of being okay at moments, and he just continues to be even, I would say he was even worse over the course of the beginning of this year. An easy choice for dud of the game here. 1-7 on Syndra. I mean, completely abused and obliterated by this Wukong, especially towards the middle part of the game. The Sylas absolutely destroyed him in lane. Very problematic. But Finn was also really bad. He gets the ridiculously strong Cassante pick here, and that should put him in a spot where he's actually able to do something in the game. We saw this earlier in the week, though. He cannot play Cassante all that well, which is not good, because Cassante is the premier pick right now in the game, and if you can't play him at an even decent level, if you're losing lane this hard as Cassante, like, that is not, like, you can't get away with that. Finn has regressed so much. I think he has clearly been one of, if not the worst top laner in the LEC over the course of the beginning of the year. I think you could say the same in the mid lane for Dior, and I think you could probably say the same in the jungle for 113, who is just not prepared for this level. We knew he wasn't prepared for this level. He really didn't play all that well in the LFL last year. He was good, and he was on a team that could compete, but he wasn't creating these same kinds of advantages that I think a lot of the other junglers in the region are. And even someone like Sheo, who I thought definitely showed moments of inconsistency over his run in the LFL and then eventually in EU Masters, I thought was significantly more polished as a prospect coming into the LEC than 113, and I think that has definitely played out in his time here. The top side for Astralis is bad, probably the worst in the league at all three positions, and that's going to be a big reason why they're sitting here at 0-5 and as the last team in the power rankings. I do want to credit them, though. Kabe and Jonghoon are good. Like, they are good players. There's a reason that this team almost made playoffs last year in summer. It's because Kabe and Jonghoon are really, really good in the bot lane. It just doesn't really matter when the rest of your team loses as hard as they do. You know, I feel bad for Kabe and Jonghoon because I think on a more competitive team, they could actually look relatively interesting. It would be kind of fun to see them, you know, I don't want to say on a team like Fnatic or a team like Excel, but you know, teams that are kind of struggling and maybe just don't have the same kind of firepower in the bot lane, it would be interesting to see if that would change anything, because I do kind of like how these two have played over the course of the last 2 years, but it just doesn't matter when your top side is losing this hard. And so overall for Astralis, not a good start to the year. In fact, probably about the worst start to the year that you could ask for. You look like a team that just has no ability to win games. Now, obviously, things can change, and they're not technically eliminated yet. I think it would take a lot for you to be technically eliminated out of, you know, top 8, but Astralis is certainly not looking like they're going to be competitive at all for any of those spots. Right now, it's just going to be about if they could even pick up a win as we go throughout the LEC split. And then for BDS, a solid win here. This team actually does look really good. They're sitting at 3-2. Nobody really thought they were going to be here. I thought they were the worst team in the league going into the year. Clearly, that is wrong. They are much, much, much more competitive than a lot of these other bottom teams. A team like Astralis ever could imagine being. And so for BDS, it really is about, can you continue to keep this pace up? Because, I mean, this is probably the best that this organization has ever looked since joining the LEC. Moving on to our second game here of day number 2. We keep the interesting train rolling. I know I use that word a lot on this channel, but man, does this perfectly describe this week of LEC action. Game number 2 saw SK Gaming take on Team Vitality. And just as SK did to the number 1 team in my power rankings, they will do to the other undefeated team and number 2 in my power rankings. They win this one, and they win it confidently. They win it looking really, really solid. I mean, what do you even want me to say? SK has now taken down the 2 best teams in the LEC after having what was, truthfully, a horrendous week 1. They were able to pull out a win over Heretics, but even then, I don't think they looked particularly fantastic. And over the course of their first 2 games, they looked completely helpless in terms of what they were able to do. That has completely changed. This is what I wanted to see out of a team like Excel over the course of a second week. Maybe not even wins, just looking like they were willing to make plays. You know what this SK team is willing to do? Make plays. They're able to go out there and try to win games, and you know what? Sometimes that's enough to take some teams like Vitality off guard. And you know what? They had some really, really good early games, and I think that's really a big key to their success for the rest of the year. But we'll get into that kind of after we talk about how this game went. Player of the game for me, no surprise, gonna go to Marcoon in the jungle. He was fantastic. I got a lot of heat in my player ranking videos for ranking Marcoon 1 spot higher than Bo, if only because I was interested to see where Bo was going to be, you know, after not having played League of Legends for a year professionally, right? I was interested to see where exactly he was going to land in terms of the LEC. I didn't want to overrate him too quickly. Now, obviously, I was correct. Obviously, I'm kidding. Bo is a fantastic player, and he had a bad game. It happens, but Marcoon is a really solid player. That's kind of the thing I want to take away from here, is that a lot of people forget that you look at Excel last year, a team that drastically overperformed for a majority of the regular season, and I would argue that Marcoon was easily the best player on that Excel team. He was the one pushing them forward, and I think that has carried over to SK Gaming here, where he has looked really good on these early game proactive champions. Obviously, 2 games of Elise here in week 2 that kind of follow that up. He was able to get Irrelevant super far ahead in the top lane on this Renekton, was able to get him moving forward, and generally was just able to outpath and out-macro Bo. which I think is always going to be the big advantage against a player like Bo who wants to take these big risks, is sometimes they're not going to pay off if you can out-macro, if you can out-position, if you can kind of predict where he is going to be, and that's what Marcoon did a really good job of in this game. He's had a fantastic week 2 so far, which is really good, because I thought he was horrendously bad in week number 1. If he can keep this form more similarly to what he had a week ago, I think Marcoon and SK Gaming are actually going to be a very scary team to face. But big credit to Irrelevant here on the Renekton. A really, really good game from him. Easily his best of the split so far. I got a comment, I believe, in a video before talking about how it was pretty ridiculous that I rated Irrelevant highly and that he was just kind of a good weak side top, not someone that can actually win you games. I implore anybody with this opinion, which I think it's a fine opinion to have, I'm not trying to sit here and criticize the opinion, but I implore people with this opinion to go and rewatch some of those Misfits games from last year, because I do think his ability to win games on his own and win top lane in general is severely understated in terms of community sentiment around the player. I think a lot of people see him as just a weak side top laner, but I think you can make a real case he is one of the more devastating teamfight top laners in the entire region, and he has been for quite a while. This is a very good game of Renekton, and I think this shows off a lot of the strength that he's able to have. When he gets matchups where he can go and play super aggressive early, he's going to be able to transition that into a late game. He's a smart player. He may not be the same kind of mechanical talent that some of the top laners in the region are, players like Photon, but even more so, players like Adam, that, kind of have that more takeover instinct, but what Irrelevant offers is this level of consistency that I just don't think a lot of other players at the position offer, and so a very, very underrated player, in my opinion. Irrelevant in the top lane had another really good game here. Certus looks good on the Syndra, Exekick and Doss look good here on the Zeri Lulu, but for the most part, this is a Marcoon show. He really dominated the map and looked fantastic doing it. As for Vitality, this is a weird way to lose your first game of the split. Again, SK Gaming, kind of the giant killers, the super team killers of the split so far. Bo loses his first ever major region professional game, having gone undefeated in the LPL, and obviously having gone undefeated at the start here on Vitality. He loses his first ever major region professional game, and it isn't entirely on the back of him, although I do think he didn't particularly play all that well. He's going to get my dud of the game here on the Maokai. He kind of just got predicted for most of this game, and that's definitely problematic. Marcoon did a really good job of generating some early leads in some crucial lanes, especially getting an early lead on himself in particular, and from that point onwards, Renekton at least just kind of controlled this Maokai. There were not a lot of plays that he could make across the map because he had to be super wary of the fact that Elise could show up at any moment. So Bo was basically neutralized from the early portion. He certainly wasn't the only player on this Vitality team to play poorly. Photon couldn't hit an Ornult to save his life. This is a champion that I never want to see him on again. I'm not sure if this is something that they practiced a ton of, but, Photon clearly not a tank player. He doesn't particularly like to stand on the front line and just kind of tank damage. He was playing really passive here on Ornn for a majority of the game, which sometimes can be fine, but in this game it certainly was not. And then, like I said, missed basically every single Ornn ultimate that he threw out. That's certainly going to need to be something they worked on. And then basically going for full AD to marksman comp here. You got Tristana, you got the Sivir. It can work out, but unfortunately in this comp it didn't, because when those marksmen lose early, it's very difficult for them to protect against a diving Renekton on the backline that just kind of completely blows them up. You add on to that the fact that Elise can basically assassinate anyone, and that you still got a Syndra and a Zeri for these backline team fight, front-to-back carries on this team, and SK was really set up in, basically after 10 minutes to just win the game as long as they didn't screw anything up, and they were able to do that. But not the worst loss in the world for a team like Vitality. You're looking at them and you're saying, well, Perks didn't play all that well, Photon and Bo didn't play all that well. Perhaps this is just one of those games, right? Vitality has shown such consistency over their first 4 games of the split that this one I'm willing to give them a little bit of leeway in. Bo was, not as cohesive with the rest of his team as he was in the first couple of games. I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he wasn't able to generate an early lead, which he had been able to do in all 4 of the other games. I'm not going to say that he is a Malrang type of player where once he generates a lead, he's great. If he doesn't generate a lead, he's bad. I do think Bo is still a very good player, even playing from behind, and someone that you certainly can't count out in a lot of these games, but sometimes it's just difficult to play from a gold disadvantage when the enemy team has an early game comp that they execute incredibly well. That can just happen every once in a while, and it felt like that really happened to Vitality in this one. So I'm not hitting the panic button just yet. I do think it is good to see that Photon, Bo, and Perks have weaknesses, that they are able to be toppled as a trio, because up until this point in the season, it really felt like they didn't have a lot of those. So it is good and interesting to see that they at least can be touched by some of these other teams, but I wouldn't expect this to be a common trend for Vitality. I would expect them to get back on track as the season moves on. But for SK Gaming, another huge win. This team is now sitting at 3-2 above 500, which is unbelievable. I had them at number 9 in my power rankings. They felt like they were an easy choice to be in the bottom 2 after week 1. And that has been completely wrong. They have now taken down G2. They have now taken down Vitality. Now, I'm not going to say that they are a team that can legitimately compete for an LEC title because I think a lot went right in these games that I'm not sure is going to be entirely repeatable as we continue on through the season. But what SK has shown is what I wanted to see when I did my power rankings at the beginning of the season, which is this team actively competing for that top 6 spot, potentially even for top 4. The ceiling of this team really is high. Marcoon is a very good player. Certus continues to grow. Relevant is incredibly underrated, and Exakick and DOS are honestly pretty decent as a bot lane. This team could legitimately pretty easily be a top 6 team by the end of the year, and I don't think me or many other people at this point would be that surprised. Moving on to game 3 here of day 2, and another interesting one, but this one actually going in the direction I think we all thought it probably would. We had G2 Esports taking on Team Heretics, and G2 absolutely clobbers them. I mean, this was an 18-minute game. A completely ludicrous stomp here from G2. One of the most dominant games I've seen in a while, and you can probably see why when you look at both comps. Yes, Heretics comp is really good, but if they get behind, they are completely and utterly doomed. And you know what? Unfortunately, they got behind in this game because look at the comp that G2 is willing to pull out. Draven, who snowballs out of control. Bel'Veth, who snowballs out of control. Jax, who snowballs out of control. If you're able to generate that early lead on the side of this G2 comp, they're just going to win the game, and it's really not going to be all that close. And that's kind of what happened here for G2. They were able to pick up a really strong victory. Where did they get most of their big advantage from? Well, in my opinion, it was through the bot lane. I know we just talked about how they weren't perfect in that SK series, and I agree with that, but what a bounce back here. You cannot give Hansama Draven. I understand that he's not had the best of the last year or so, but it's still his signature pick, and he can still dominate on it like nobody else in the LEC right now. It really is unstoppable, and they have that level 1 fight down there in the bottom lane, which honestly doesn't go terribly for Heretics, but basically from that point onwards, it's just G2 slowly chipping away, getting lead after lead after lead, until one of the best hooks I've ever seen happens with Mickey basically perfectly threading the needle on Nautilus to hit the hook on a dashing Lucian and pick up the kill on him. That gets Draven snowballing basically out of control, and the game is over from there. Based off of that, not just that hook, but generally how the lane phase played out, Mickey X is going to get my player of the game here for G2. It really is a great combo to see a player like Mickey X on a team like G2. I mean, I hate to say it, but he's a completely different player on this organization than he is on any other org. He was very good on Misfits, but when he went to G2, it went to another level. He was okay, not really all that good on Excel, and now that he's back on G2, none of that matters. He's good again. It really is just Mickey and G2 are a perfect combo, I would say, for each other, and I think Mickey actively is making a player like Hansama a lot better, and I think that's generally going to be good for G2. Now, I don't want to take away from Hansama. He played a really, really good game on the Draven here. His signature pick, obviously, he knows how to get that champion out of control, and he absolutely executed on it. Hans and Mickey were the 2 players for G2 that impressed me the most in this performance, but you gotta give a big shout out to Yike. He was out-jungled by Marcoon earlier in the week. To see him bounce back and have a really nice showing here on the Bel'Veth, where he's just able to control the map and just dominate Jankos, quite frankly, is really impressive. Those 3v3s in the bot lane really screwed Jankos, especially on that Elise pick, and Yike took advantage of it by just making the game unwinnable from that point onwards. But then, you've also got Broken Blade, you've also got Caps here. It kind of continues to be a story that Broken Blade and Caps are the players that I talk about the least here on G2. That was the case in week 1, and has been the case here in week 2 so far. I'm not sure if that's going to keep up for the rest of the year, but it's interesting to see that Yike has taken a big focus in the top side, and that Hans and Mickey are really the power point on the map in terms of laning for G2. I don't know if that's going to continue, but it definitely is an interesting transgression. And then for Heretics on the other side, not a great game. I mean, you got completely and utterly obliterated, but there are some takeaways. First of all, jungle bot lane duo got completely run over, and that's going to happen sometimes. I feel bad for Jankos because his scoreline looks horrendously bad, and it's not like he played particularly well, but on the Elise, he spent a ton of resources trying to salvage what Jack Spectra and Mursa were doing in the bottom lane, and it just was not supposed to be salvaged. It was not going to be salvaged, and unfortunately, that caused Team Heretics to really just lose the game on the spot. Jack Spectra is going to get my dud of the game here on the Lucian. Not only was he super over-aggressive in the early game against Hansama, really giving him everything that he wanted to get, but once he got behind, he did absolutely nothing to stop this Draven and this Nautilus from being out of control. He was kind of the victim, I would say, of G2 really taking over, and this is the big kind of gap in these two teams, in my opinion, is you look at a team like G2 and you've got the experience, you've got players that know when to be aggressive and when to not be aggressive. And then a player, some players on Heretics that are maybe just there to do the best that they can. I think the gap here in the bot lane was definitely noticeable, and that's why Jack Spectra is going to get my dud of the game here. Mercy didn't play much better, but he was significantly less risky and significantly less overextended when it came to a lot of these plays. Jack was just not in the right position at the right time. It's certainly something to get concerned about. He has his ups, he has his downs so far in the LEC, and then Evie and Ruby just kind of were there. Evie got run over in the top lane on this Cassante, which is a little bit concerning. This is a pick that he has dominated on in the year so far. I've been talking about how it's ridiculous that teams continue to give him this Cassante pick, but clearly G2 knew what they were doing. Broken Blade just pulls out the Jax. He plays it really safe early, and then by the time we get to team fights, the game is so far out of reach for Heretics that there's nothing that they can do. Really, it's kind of an easy game to talk about. I really don't have to spend a ton of time talking about it. For Heretics, overall, this was just a slaughter. I'm not going to say that this is a good thing. I'm certainly not going to say this is a good thing, but Heretics certainly aren't going to be this bad, I would say, throughout the entirety of the rest of the year. G2 probably had a point to prove in this game, I would say, especially going up against Yankos, and so I would imagine that this is just an unfortunate loss for Heretics. They're probably about the same team that we thought they were going into this game. They're a good team, but not a great team. A team that might be competing for somewhere around top 6, but is unlikely to be, locked in for that spot. Obviously, everybody is kind of in contention for that right now, but Heretics certainly not with the performance that bolsters their credibility. As for G2, this is a nice bounce back. After losing to SK, we needed something to bring back some momentum, obviously, to make the clash against Vitality later in the week feel even bigger, and so this was a good version of that. Obviously, Yike, Hans, Mickey, they continue to look really good. If Broken Blade and Caps are your two least important members of the team, you know you're doing something right, and that's how it feels for G2 right now. If the bot lane can continue to win, G2 will probably continue to win, but that really does feel like the break point for this team overall is Hans and Mickey. If they're going to play like this, though, I think G2's in some pretty good hands. Now we get to move on to the fourth game of day 2, and you know what? We can talk about it. It's certainly a game. We had Fnatic taking on Excel, and I guess there was a winner. I mean, officially speaking, Fnatic won the game, but I don't think anyone won this game. Fnatic certainly didn't win in terms of how they played in their perception. Excel certainly didn't win because they lost the game. You know who most especially lost was us, the fans. God, this game was awful. It was boring. It was just not good. There was no good in this game. And it was hard for me to actually find things to write down in terms of analysis because neither team played well. Both teams played to lose, and it's just kind of frustrating to say that. Let's go ahead and talk about Fnatic first. Actually, you know what? Screw it. I'm going out of order here because Excel played better, so I'm actually going to talk about them first. Excel certainly had a game. In fact, I'm really impressed with them because they won early game. This is something that they haven't been able to do consistently at all. Who knew if you drafted Lucian Nami, you'd be able to win early game? Credit to Patrick. He actually played this game incredibly well. And credit to Targamas. Those two, honestly speaking, were probably the two best players in the game here. Patrick and Targamas, I thought, really did play well, especially early on. They were able to generate a nice lead in the bot lane. They were able to do some things. They just transitioned it into literally nothing as we got further into the game. Odoamne had a decent early game. He beat up on Wonder a little bit early in the Renekton Intanar matchup. We've seen this over and over again throughout the years. And it's pretty much always been Renekton favored, at least especially early on in games. So Odo did a good job there. Xerxes, I thought, had an impact on the game, which is more so than what he has had, I think, in pretty much any of their games before this. However, Excel is going to excel. They're going to make some boneheaded decision in the mid part of the game and lose it. I feel like you hit a point in the LEC, and this has become a pretty big trend for a lot of LEC teams where it's just oh, I guess it's time to hit Baron. I guess it's time to try and take Baron, when realistically speaking, it only is negative for you. Excel goes ahead, tries to start Baron. It gets stolen by freaking Narq of all things. What are we doing, folks? What are we doing? How does Narq steal Baron? Fnatic's able to team fight and win the game because they've hit level 11 Kassadin, and he's basically just able to take over. I mean, what a brutal game overall for Excel. I actually do think they had the two best players in the game here, which is why I've given Targamas my player of the game. I think he was the best player between these two teams. I know some people are going to give it to Humanoid, some people are going to give it to Wonder, but for me, I thought Targamas played the best of any of the players on the two teams here. And honestly, Patrick wasn't super far behind him. This actually reminds me a lot of Excel's game against BDS in week 1, where Excel lost that game, or I'm sorry, Excel won that game, even though they were the worst team, because just some random shenanigan Baron, in that case, Dragon play happens towards the back half where the team throws, and they're able to win. Excel gives that win right back here to Fnatic. And unfortunately, Patrick and Targamas, very similar to Crowny and Lebrov in that game, just have to suffer the consequences. In fact, I think that those two games actually have a lot of parallels and a lot of similarities. For me, done of the game, super easy to call here. It's going to go to VTO, who is just not good. Like, I don't know what to tell you. VTO was so ridiculously good over the last 2 years on Misfits. To see him join Excel and then immediately just become one of the most passive, like, unimpactful mids in the entire league that I've actually seen in the LEC in a really long time. It's not that he's actively bad, it's that he's actively nothing. Like, he's not playing the game. I just don't know what to say. VTO needs to get back to the form that he's in. Obviously, this team did sign Abadage. I'm not saying that he should come in and play right now, because VTO should just be the better player by every stretch of the imagination. But, man, VTO just does not have it right now, so he's getting done of the game. Targamas is getting player of the game here for Excel. But on the side of Fnatic, congrats! You lucked yourself into a victory here. I don't think it was intentional, but man, I'm proud of you. You know, credit to Razork. I thought he made some good plays towards the back half of the game. Some of those Wukong ults were actually really impactful. I thought Reckless did a good job of staying out of trouble. Wonder, obviously, big credit with the Baron steal, and then Humanoid eventually hit that level on Kassadin, the level 16, where he was just able to take over the game with those Rift Walks, and you know, good for him. But for the most part, Fnatic still has some major question marks. I mean, this team got wrecked in the early game again. That's 5 games in a row now to start off your season where Fnatic's early games have gone absolutely horrendously. And I think that is a trend that is very worrying, because this is a team that is very early game dependent. You're looking at this roster and you're not seeing a lot of players that are typically good playing from behind. Razork and Humanoid certainly are not players that are good from playing from behind. Reckless has never really historically been a player that has been great playing from behind. It's really just Wonder that I think has experience being someone who can kind of rebound from a tough laning phase. And if Fnatic is going to continue to be a team that loses the early game, that needs bailouts in order to be successful, they're going to struggle throughout this year. This game was a win, but honestly, it soured me more on both of these teams than any of the games beforehand, and especially Fnatic. I don't think this is a recipe for success. They're going to be happy to be able to have walked out of this game with a win, but it's certainly not something I'm going to expect them to be able to continue to do. And for Excel, on the other hand, I mean, you genuinely might be like a bottom 2 team in the league. And that is, like I said earlier, unacceptable. It is literally unacceptable for you to be able to do that. You're sitting at 1-4, having not been able to beat basically anybody. Your team looks completely dead, like mentally. VTO is not good. Xerxes is not good. Patrick and Targamas finally, for the first time this split, had a good game. It was literally their first good game the entire split, and it didn't matter because the team threw it away at Baron with a stupid call where they just end up losing the game. I'm not really sure what to say about this Excel team other than they are a disaster. They need to turn it around, but I'm not even sure if I'm expecting them to at this point. They really don't have a lot of pieces that lead me to believe like, oh, well, it'll come together. They just need to get back on the same page. They look completely mental boomed, and honestly, if I had to take a guess, it might continue to be a problem as the season goes on. But good for Fnatic, just good for Excel. You gave us the weakest game of the year by far, and I guess that's worth something. Moving on to our final game here of day 2 in the LEC here. Obviously, every week is a super week now, so we're still going long. We had a matchup between Koi and Mad Lions, and Mad Lions was able to pick up another really strong victory here. A very impressive showing from Mad early on in this season. Going 4-1 is nothing to be scoffed at, and especially doing so over a team like Koi, who, yes, is certainly showing some problems, which we will get into in this review, but you know, it's not like Koi is a team that is lacking talent entirely and hasn't shown anything in this season so far. For Mad to be able to pick up a win so confidently here looks really good. So, where is it going right for Mad? Well, you know, again, I've talked about the jungle mid a lot when it comes to Mad Lions. Elyoya and Niski are on the same page basically at all times, and Elyoya creates so much pressure for the map in general. He creates so much for every player on Mad Lions that obviously it just helps out the team in total, but I gotta give credit where credit is due, and the credit right now has to go to this Mad Lions bot lane, which has continued to look really good over the start of this season. Player of the game for me is gonna go to Hylissang in the support position. This was a very good game from Hilly. He's the kind of player that I honestly don't know whether or not I would expect to be good at Ashe. He's kind of right there in the middle where I think, oh, he could be fantastic at an AD carry where he can't run it down and, you know, he's prioritized for staying super far back. Or he could be like, oh, he's trying to play it like Nautilus, right? Like, it could be either, and I think realistically I would believe it when it comes to Hylissang, but turns out he's actually really good at the Ashe. Those arrows were absolutely on point. He was setting Carzzy up for so much this game. Comp really couldn't play all that much in laning phase because he was constantly getting slowed by the Ashe here and was constantly being pressured out. Carzzy and Hylissang were just better, and for that, Hilly's going to get player of the game. This very much felt like a return to spring of last year Hylissang. Obviously, I had a lot of problems with Hylissang in summer of last year, but spring, Hylissang was an MVP candidate. I think a lot of us forget that, and so it's really good to see him kind of get back to that more confident form that I think he was there. Big credit to Carzzy as well. This is not the same Carzzy that was on Vitality last year. It is not even close. He is so much more confident. He is so much more prepared, I guess is the word I would like to use, to make these aggressive plays. I think last year on Vitality, he would often go and try and make a lot of these super aggressive, very risky 50-50 plays in the bot lane to try and generate major leads, and oftentimes he wouldn't really set them up and he wouldn't really be ready to make them. I think, this year he is still doing a lot of these aggressive plays. He's forcing wins, he's forcing lane advantages. But in doing so, he's setting them up properly. He's putting himself in wave positions where it matters if he actually does gain a small advantage. Like, if he's able to push Lucian out of lane early on in this game with that wave crashing, that is huge. He's actually forcing not only Comp to back early, and, Carzzy's going to gain some XP that way, but he's also forcing Comp to lose an entire minion wave. Like, that is super positive stuff, right? Those are the kinds of little things that Carzzy just wasn't doing last year, and so to see him doing them like so consistently at the beginning of the year, I'm not going to say it's entirely on Hylissang, but I really do think this bot lane duo has completely solidified a lot of the problems I had with both of them towards the end of last year. I think they are so good for each other, and I think both of them looked fantastic in this game. You could give player of the game, in my opinion, to Carzzy, but for me, it is going to go to Hylissang. I thought he was just slightly more impactful, and I liked how he played just a tad bit more. Elyoya and Niski continue to be power points on the map. Niski actually takes a little bit more of a back seat in this game than he had through the first couple of games, which is good because there was a really strong focus on the bot side from Elyoya, and he did a great job being able to capitalize on that. Elyoya is, in my opinion, still the best jungler in the region. I think he is incredibly strong at pathing, and I think he's really consistent. He's going to be good every single game, no matter what. That's the difference between him and Malrang. That's the difference between him and Yike, even him and Bo. I think Bo is really good, right? But I think Bo takes significantly more crazy risks than Elyoya does. Not that Elyoya doesn't take risks, just that I think a lot of the risks that he does take feel very calculated, and they feel like they are going to pay off with how he plays the game. And another really, really good game from him. A really solid start to the week for Elyoya. He's been really underratedly fantastic to start the year, in my opinion, for Mad Lions. But those three players really stood out to me. Niski and Chasey, again, more backseat here in terms of their impact on the game. Chasey was better than Shigenda by a lot. I would say he definitely outlaned him, which is not what you want to see if you're a Koi fan. I thought these two were probably the most inexperienced, unproven top laners going into the year. To see Chasey just kind of win, not particularly solid. And then Niski just outplayed Larson. Larson was actually a little bit of a problem for the game. This was one of Larson's worst games, which we'll get into in a bit, but Niski did a really good job taking advantage of it. But moving over to Koi, a lot of problems for Koi, mostly starting in the bot lane. I mean, what happened to Comp? This is just not the same player that was on this rogue team last year. He was so consistent, especially with Lucian Nami. I mean, when this bot lane got Lucian Nami last year, it was game over. There was literally nothing anybody on the enemy team could do in order to stop these two from winning lane and transitioning it into a really strong mid game for Rogue. That is not what happened in this game. They got blown out of the water by Varus Ashe. Comp was just pushed out of lane consistently. He was not playing particularly well. He was overextended in the mid game. He's an easy choice for dead of the game. He was really, really bad here, and I don't really know what happened. Obviously, I don't know what the difference is between last year and this year. I don't know if Odo's shot calling just completely changed how Comp wants to play laning phase. I don't really know what's going on. That's my big problem, right, is you see a lot of people online pointing to Odo Omne leaving and being like, that clearly must have been the only thing that that was the thing that changed. That's the only thing that could be affecting Koi here. Why is Comp losing lane so hard because of Odo Omne leaving? Like, that I don't understand. That does not compute in my head. He just doesn't have the confidence right now. Trimby's not playing particularly well either, although I do think he's playing much better than Comp. I do think Comp just has to step up. I think if he can get some confidence back, we know he can be one of the more, if not the most mechanically talented AD carry in the entire region. We know that he can play a variety of these early game champions that want to push their leads and move forward. Maybe the Karzi Hylissang matchup was just bad for him, but this is starting to become a trend. You know, they're sitting at 2 and 3 now, and pretty much all 3 of those losses Comp has been entirely irrelevant, which is not good. Moving on to Larssen, like I said earlier, this is probably his worst game in a very long time. He's not a player that often loses hard. Like, that's the big benefit to a player like Larssen, is he doesn't take these crazy risks. He doesn't generate these ridiculous leads that some of these other mid laners in the region can do, but he doesn't really ever lose, especially 1v1. He lost 1v1 in this game. He kind of got run over. Elyoya did a good job of marking him on that Azir, making sure that he didn't have a lot of opportunity to make plays around the map, and making sure that anytime he overstepped in the mid lane, Niski and Elyoya were going to be able to capitalize on it. But this was a very unstandard Larssen performance as well. It's crazy to me to say that Malrang and Shigenda were kind of the not as bad parts of the game for Koi. That's not really what I expected to say. Larssen and Comp were just not good in this one, and it does worry me a bit that that could be a trend moving forward. So what does this mean for the two teams overall? Well, I'm a little bit worried about Koi. They're not Rogue. This is not 2022 Rogue. This team clearly has some issues that that team just did not have, and they're going to need to figure that out. Most notably, in my opinion, this bot lane just has to get back to winning in the bot lane. That was a big part of their ability to translate leads early game last year, was Malrang's ability to generate leads for Comp and Trimby incredibly efficiently, and then have that bot lane just scale into the late game so you can get Larssen, you can get Shigenda in positions where they can actually try and fight for these late game objectives and team fights. That's not really where Koi is right now. Their early games have been much worse, and I think that is the main area that I'd be looking at them to improve. As for Mad Lions, you're looking solid. This bot lane looks really good. This jungle mid looks really good. Chasey is just kind of fine in the top lane. He's just kind of there. I don't think that's problematic. I think you've got plenty of carry players on the team, but I don't necessarily think he's a superstar. I just think Mad's kind of clicking. Very similar to what I said earlier. They're a very solid team. It's going to be interesting to see what happens when they go up against a team like G2 later in the season, but for now, honestly, I really like how this team is looking, and to me, they are a clear cut above a lot of these other teams that are going to be fighting for top 6. That's going to bring us to our third and final day of LEC action here in Week 2, and we kicked off our third and final day with a matchup of the least, and I can't believe I'm saying this, but we saw Excel take on Astralis, and Astralis picked up their first win of the year. Excel goes 0-3 this week. They're sitting at 1-5. Tied for last place now with Astralis, the team that just beat them. Utterly disgusting showing from this Excel team. We'll talk about them in a bit, but hey, look! Astralis won a game! That's gotta be pretty exciting, right? We've all gotta feel pretty good about that. It certainly looked good. It actually was a pretty dominant win from this Astralis team. They certainly were the better team in this game, and so there's a lot to talk about, but let's go ahead and get onto the Astralis train, which I think a lot of people who have been on it throughout the year know that this bot lane is the one driving it. 1,000%. Kabe and Jonghoon are the strong point of this team, and in Astralis' first win, that did not change even a little bit. A great game from Kabe here on the Lucian, but player of the game was so simple for me to pick here. Is going to go to Jonghoon on that Nami. I mean, a ridiculous Nami game. You don't really see a lot of people playing Nami this explosively. I think that's the word that I used in my notes that I really liked here, was explosively. He was willing to, go in and try and get his ult on 3 or 4 people. He was willing to flash in a lot of these team fights to land crucial bubbles on 1 or 2 people in certain cases. He was just willing to play ridiculously aggressive in order to set the rest of his team up for a lot of these plays. Obviously, they were ahead, and so we had the luxury of being able to do so, but I can count on my left hand, the amount of Namis in the world that are willing to make the plays that Jonghoon made in this game consistently at a pro level, and so very impressed with him. I've talked about him a ton on this channel's history. Over the course of last year, I was super high on him as a player, and I continue to be. Him and Kabe continue to be a big strong point for this Astralis team in general, and I certainly don't think that changed over the course of this game. Jonghoon definitely deserves player of the game, and Kabe continues to look really solid next to him. They have a very good synergy together. I totally understand why Astralis wanted to bring them back. Don't really understand why both of them wanted to stay on Astralis, but I understand why they were brought back. They looked really, really good here, kind of dominating Patrick and Targamas, which we'll get to, and they were a big reason for the win. I think another encouraging thought here is, you look at Finn and Dior, they weren't feeding. They didn't ink the game away, and that's always going to be a good sign for Astralis. They haven't often done that over the course of the year so far, and so to see both of them, relatively speaking, have good games, to see Finn solo killing Otawamne in the top lane on Gnar, that's pretty insane. To see Dior just kind of survive against VTO and honestly have a much bigger impact in the game, that is a good thing. Overall, I would say Astralis is probably looking at this, saying this is best case scenario for how a lot of this turned out. As for Excel, complete opposite. Worst case scenario, hit the panic button, alarms blaring. You might be the worst team in the league. I've been talking about, oh, you can't afford, like, it is unacceptable for you to be bottom 2. You just lost to 0-5 Astralis. You are the worst team in the league right now. This is inexcusable. I mean, there's really nothing else to say. This team is garbage, and it's because of everyone. I've seen a lot of blame thrown on 1 or 2 or 3 players in particular. No, it's everyone's fault. No one is playing well on this Excel team. Easy dud of the game choice here with Targamas. I just gave him some praise in the Fnatic game because it felt like him and Patrick were the only ones actually trying to win for Excel in that game. Well, that's completely gone now. I mean, 9 ints. Like, I'll be honest, I don't remember a good play from Targamas in this game. It was brutal. VTO continues to maybe be the worst player on this team. I think there's a really solid argument to say that VTO has just simply been the worst player on Excel, and you couldn't have predicted that at the beginning of the year. I certainly couldn't have predicted that. I remember specifically, he ulted in on Talia right into 5 members of Astralis and just died. And you could see on his camera, he was just like, oh my god. And it's just like, I get it. Like, you're tilted off of your mind. Like, you don't have any confidence in yourself right now, but you gotta figure that out. You're at an LEC level. You can't just lose your confidence. You have to learn how to get it back. Credit a bit to Patrick. I thought he tried to play, but Jonghoon flash bubbling him in every single fight didn't really make it easy on the Draven. And then Odo was getting solo killed on the top side. Xerxes had literally 0 pressure. Basically, nothing went right for Excel in this game, and that's kind of been the story of the year so far. They're sitting at 1-5, with their only win being BDS basically handing the game to them. And so I'm sitting here looking at Excel saying, okay, yeah, you're like the worst team in the league right now. I'm not saying that they're going to be the worst team in the league for the rest of the split. You would sure hope that they would be better than Astralis over the course of the final week of the season, but right now they're the worst team in the league. They just lost to the other worst team in the league very decisively, and so I don't really know what to tell you. Everything is going wrong. None of these players are good. VTO looks like he might need to be benched. He has 0 confidence and 0 ability to play the game right now. I can't begin to tell you what to say when it comes to Excel. This is a disaster. As for Astralis, yeah, you picked up your first win. This is good because, remember, you only have to not be bottom 2, and there are a lot of teams like Excel, like a team like Fnatic, that are struggling right now. This win actually does maybe matter. This puts them in a position where next week, if they can pick up some crucial wins and, you know, really cement themselves as like a 3-win team, that could potentially be enough to not be bottom 2 by the end of the first round robin. A lot of that is going to be off the back of this bot lane. If they continue to play like this, and as long as the solo laners don't just completely run it down like they have in basically every other game, Astralis technically kind of does have a chance to survive this first cut of teams. Moving on to our second game here of day number 3. We had another really interesting clash. 2 teams above 500 facing off against each other. We saw Team BDS taking on Mad Lions. And BDS picks up another win, a 3-0 week for BDS. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comment section, obviously. This is the first 3-0 in BDS's history, and it looks freaking good. It looks awesome. I'm really, really excited for this team. They're probably the team that I'm buying into the most so far at the beginning of the season with how they have played, at least in terms of over expectations. Obviously, I'm not counting Vitality, G2, etc., right? But like, in terms of what they were supposed to be and what they ended up being, I think I bought in the most to BDS being like actually good. This win was super impressive, and this just goes to show, you know, I'm not going to say this to all pro teams out there, but for a lot of them, play what you're good at. Like, play the stuff that you know you can play at a high level. If that means playing weak side bot with freaking Tom Kench Jhin and playing super passive into a Thresh, go ahead and do that. If that means you can enable your Darius top laner in Adam here, who just popped off. I mean, he literally 1v3'd up on top side in this game. That was incredibly impressive. Adam is an easy choice for player of the game, and he has really shown everything that you could want to see from him coming back to the LEC here. A lot of people had concerns that his champion pool that he dominated with in the LFL and in EU Masters was not going to translate to the LEC because last time he was in the LEC on BDS, it did not translate. But let's go ahead and think back to that year on BDS, or at least that start of the year on BDS last year, and where he was. He wasn't playing Darius. He wasn't playing Olaf. Like, he was pulling them out a couple of times, but he didn't look bad on those champions. It was the Aurelia. It was the tanks where he was just getting run over. It was moving him away from his comfort zone, but he's back in that comfort zone now, and he is dominating. This very much feels like 2021 Fnatic Adam all over again. And that's a scary prospect for the league because he is genuinely one of the few top laners that I think can just straight up win games from that side of the map. He can win lanes so hard that the game is almost unwinnable on champions like this. Obviously, big credit to his supporting cast. They have been very good all year long. Shea with another good game of Maokai. Nuke with a good game of Azir. And I want to talk about this. Nuke went from somebody who I considered easily the worst mid laner in the region, just because I think he'd never really shown anything, to honestly pretty competent over the course of the year so far. He did a very good job playing in Aniski. Although we've talked about it, the Azir into Akali matchup is incredibly Azir favored, so he should have done pretty well in this matchup. But it's worth noting that Nuke is no longer the hindrance that I think he was for a lot of last year, and even for his time on Schalke. He's actually been really solid over the beginning half of this year. Sheo has adjusted really well. Crowny and Labrov, I've already sung their praises on this channel over the course of the first 2 weeks. This BDS team is honestly really good, and they do have a potential star player, and I mean that seriously, a potential star player in Adam on this team. He is someone who can be good enough to drag a team to top 4, top 5, similar to what someone like VTO did for Misfits over the past few years. He is that kind of player, and he can be that for BDS, and so really exciting to see if he's going to be able to hold on to that over the course of the rest of the year. For Mad Lions, on the other hand, and a frustrating loss. Obviously, you had had such a good week leading up to this. You really wanted to walk out of week 2, I think, with a 3-0. But I think it could have absolutely been worse. I think that you went up against a BDS team that is clearly clicking on all cylinders right now. And while nobody on your team particularly played well, I don't think anybody played awful. My dud of the game is going to go to Niski in the mid lane. I thought the Akali was just generally pretty useless here. You might look at it and say like, oh, well, he had 4 of the team's 7 kills. How do you give him dud of the game? He didn't really get a lot of those kills on his own. Yeah, a lot of them were relatively set up, and so Niski for me is going to get dud of the game here. And also, KDA doesn't really matter all that much. I mean, it matters if it shows up in the tape, but the tape is what matters at the end of the day, and I felt like Niski was the one getting overpowered the most, although I think realistically you could give this to Chasey in the top lane as well. I was just kind of talking about this when it came to Mad Lions, a little bit before when they had their win over Koi, where Chasey's not really going to be a super big strength in the top lane. I think we kind of saw that a bit in this game. If there is an area where Mad Lions can be a little bit exploited, I do think it is going to be on this top side. A really strong and aggressive top laner like Adam can bully Chasey a tad bit in this laning phase. Obviously, Darius does a really good job playing into Cassante, in my opinion. I think that is a really good matchup for Darius, and so for Adam to be able to generate that lead, it wasn't particularly surprising, but Matt, I think, reacted to that situation very poorly. I think their response to Darius winning top lane super hard was to just try and kill the Darius, and then, the 1v3 happens and the game is completely out of control at that point. Carzzy and Hill is saying not necessarily building on the fantastic performances that they showed earlier in the week. Not an awful game from them, but certainly not what they were, doing earlier in the week. I think overall for Matt, it's just kind of hard to talk about any specific mistakes that they made because the game wasn't really on Matt. The game and the focus of all of this was on BDS. This was BDS playing well, not necessarily Matt throwing the game. And so, Matt's going to be frustrated that they weren't able to pick up a win, but I think overall, it's not the worst loss in the world. BDS certainly looks good, and you're sitting at 4-2. There are certainly worse places to be, and that's going to be the same for BDS here. You're now sitting at 4-2. You're looking really, really solid to lock yourself in for that top 8 spot, and that's something I did not predict for BDS going into the year. So for them to look like they're going to be able to do it so efficiently is fantastic. If Adam continues to be a legitimate MVP candidate, if Crowny and Labrov continue to be solid, if Sheo and Nuke continue to be really, really consistent in the mid to jungle, your mid-jungle duo, BDS is genuinely going to be a top 6-ish team in the LEC, especially with how a lot of these other teams are playing. And let me tell you, that is certainly not what I predicted for this roster going into 2023. Jumping into our third game here of day number 3. Another matchup that I just got to talk about. Another upset. I'll get right to it. It's Koi taking on SK Gaming, and SK has run the gauntlet. They have done it. Another win here for SK, this time in 29 minutes, but they did it. This week, they have now officially, in order, beaten G2 Esports, Team Vitality, and Koi. Arguably, the 3 best teams in Europe, or at least the projected 3 best teams in Europe, by my power rankings, by a lot of other people's power rankings. What the hell is going on, man? I mean, what a week for SK. You gotta be super proud of this team for them to rebound after what was, quite frankly, a super tumultuous start to the year in week number 1. Obviously, they're able to pull out that win against Heretics, and that clearly built enough confidence for them to become giant killers over the next 3 games. I'm just hopeful that they're able to keep it up, but let's go ahead and talk about this performance in general. For SK, pretty much everything worked again, but more specifically, I think in the last game, I talked a lot about how the top side of the map was incredibly strong for them, about how Irrelevant and Marcoon in particular did really, really well in that matchup against Vitality. Well, I actually think we're moving downwards as we talk about this matchup against Koi. Exakick is going to get my player of the game here in the bottom lane. He has honestly been the most impressive rookie AD carry to me. More so than someone like Jack Spectra. I think Exakick has really shown a lot at the LEC level. He has shown that he knows how to play aggressive, especially in the mid game, when he gets a matchup that he thinks he can win, which he clearly thought he could win this one against Comp and Trimby of all people, but he clearly thought it, and then he went and executed on it. But what's impressed me the most is he knows exactly when he needs to play safe as well. I think that is a very big trait for AD carries. He can't always just be running it down. That is sometimes my problem with other AD carries that people consider top AD carries in the world. Players like Fnatic, players like Aiming, that I think sometimes just aren't in the right spots because they want to make these crazy, ridiculous plays. It's good if you're able to make them, but you have to know when to make them. That really makes you one of the best ADCs in the world. Exakick shows signs of being that guy, and I think that is incredibly impressive and huge for an organization like SK that will not often find prospects like that, but big credit to Doss as well. Obviously, really good game for him on the Yuumi. Not particularly easy to scout how well a Yuumi is playing, but he definitely did well enough for them to dominate laning phase. I feel like Lucian Yuumi, generally speaking, is actually quite weak. I've talked about this a lot of different times. I think the Nami for Lucian trade is almost always in favor of Nami. I think that that is just generally a better... I think Nami's a better champion when you separate the two and when you separate the duo, but credit to Exakick and Doss, quite frankly, they were just the better players in this game. And then I also want to give a big shout out and big credit to Certus in the mid lane. He continues to look fantastic. He gets one of his signature champions here in the Akali. He gets to go up against Larson, one of the better mids in the region, and honestly, he looks fantastic. He makes some really, really good plays early on in the game. But really what stood out for me was that amazing teleport towards the back half of the game. That's certainly one of those plays that looks stupid if you just get insta-CC'd and died. But when you pull it off and when you're able to just completely blow someone up, you look like an absolute genius. And Certus, in this case, looks like an absolute genius. I think he has also grown a lot. Marcoon looked really good this week. Irrelevant was solid in the top lane. Honestly, everything was just clicking for SK Gaming. I don't really have much else to say. Exakick and Certus were the big stars of the game, but everybody on SK Gaming is playing really, really well right now. As for Koi... whew, this is not good. An 0-3 week is not what you wanted to see. You're up there with Excel now in that 0-3 week. You're sitting at 2-4. You had a slightly better week 1, but you're going to start hitting that panic button as well. You don't have a lot of time. Single round robin doesn't give you a lot of excuses for these losses, and you really need to figure out what the issues are, because the issues are apparent. We were talking about Comp and Trimby as easily the best bot lane in Europe last year, and what was almost certainly going to be one of, if not the best bot lane in Europe again this year. Not the case. Not even a little bit. This was a 2v2. Let's not get this mistaken. You can see Exakick and Doss won, but you can be like, oh, maybe Marcoon was there ganking them, maybe giving them pressure. Nope. This was a straight 2v2 the entire game, and Comp and Trimby just got run over. I would argue they got the better end of the duo as well, with Ezreal Nami theoretically being able to outtrade Lucian Yuumi here. Like, they should be able to win these fights. They just were not able to because they didn't play as well. Trimby is going to get my dud of the game here, but Comp has also just been bad through the last week or so. Obviously, there have to be things that you can do to fix this, morale issue, because that's what it has to be. We know that these two players are good enough, mechanically to be able to keep up, but they just clearly have been mental boomed here, and they are definitely in a position where they need to get that back, because right now, the main win condition for a team that won the LEC last year is just no longer available for them, and they don't really know what else to do. Larson pulls out the Tristana here, which is very odd. I don't really think it fits with a lot of the rest of the team comp that you have built around here, but he's not able to generate a large enough lead for you to be able to do anything. He does have some good plays there in the mid lane, but for the most part, it's not really all that impactful. The Maokai, the Renekton, nothing is working for this roster. I would say overall, when you're looking at Koi from a general standpoint, it's time to worry, because if this bot lane doesn't get it together, Koi might not be a team that can compete for top 4. And if Koi is a team that is not competing for top 4 after just winning the split and only replacing one member, that's problematic. Again, I see a lot of people on social media talking about how, oh, I guess getting rid of Odo was the problem and Shigenda's the problem. that should not matter for the 2v2 in the bot lane. Like, it really, I don't know what that could possibly affect. Odo was not shot calling Comp and Trimby's micro in the 2v2 in the bottom lane. They are just worse. And that is the problem for Koi. If those two can get back to playing where they were just last year, or even really like the beginning of last week, I think Koi is actually going to be in a spot where they are going to be very dangerous to face for pretty much anybody in the league, because Comp and Trimby are the lifeblood that will let the rest of this team flow, that will let Malrang look a lot better, that will let Larson look a lot better. But right now, because those two are underperforming so much, I'm very scared for what Koi is going to be for the rest of this split. They have to get it together. As for SK Gaming, 4-2, beating all of the 3 biggest threats in Europe. You're looking fantastic. Pretty much everything you could have asked for if you were an SK fan came true this week. Marcoon, Certus, Exakick, Irrelevant, DOS, all 5 of them looked fantastic, and this could be a team that legitimately competes with some of the other best teams in the LEC. I don't know what to tell you. Like, they're right up on that level with BDS, you know, other best teams in the LEC. Pretty insane of me to say, right? But that's the world we live in. SK, BDS, these teams are legit, and they keep proving it game after game. Now it's finally time to talk about the game that everyone was most excited for in Week 2. We have a top-of-the-table clash of 4-1 versus 4-1. We saw G2 Esports taking on Team Vitality. And Vitality picks up an absolutely massive win here, and they solidify themselves as, in my opinion, the best team in the EU right now. A huge win for this team. Obviously, both kind of rebounding after some losses to SK Gaming earlier in the week, but Vitality obviously doing so in a much more concrete fashion. We'll get to G2 in a bit, because I do think this game shows a lot about G2 as a team and where they're at right now, but let's go ahead and talk about Vitality in general. Let's go ahead and talk about the major players for Vitality here. Photon, Bo, Perks. We know that those are the 3 that are going to carry this team across the finish line. They have been dominating all year long already, and you know what? No change here. Bo is so ridiculously aggressive and so ridiculously talented that a lot of these plays that look like they may be super questionable to the naked eye, you know, i.e. me, end up being fantastic plays, because the entire team is just entirely committed to keeping with Bo, pushing forward, fighting whenever he wants, just playing as a unit, playing as a team, and it works out so well. Bo is an easy choice for player of the game here, as he has been in a lot of these games so far for Vitality. He just looks so good when he gets the chance to play his style, which is super skirmish heavy. He gets put on the Vi here. I always talk about the Vi pick as something that you do need to be better as a jungler to succeed on. Bo is better than Yike. In my opinion, that was very clear in this game, and we'll get to that. I don't love the Udyr pick. I certainly think that does play a part in it, but Bo is just generally more aggressive, more willing to go in, and credit to Photon, credit to Perks, they are willing to back him up at literally any moment, in any circumstance. They will leave lane, they will leave CS in order to fight with Bo, and it is to this team's advantage. Definitely. Big credit to Photon in the top lane. He actually did it. He won a game on Gwen versus K'Sante. I know K'Sante isn't doing all that hot in the LEC right now. I'm certainly not going to pretend like he's a bad pick, because he's not a bad pick, but teams are really starting to learn how to play against the K'Sante. Gwen has not really been that. Gwen's not really been the pick that has fixed it. I've talked about that a bit in this video and a lot of other videos. But you know what? Photon finally did it. He won a game as Gwen versus K'Sante, and this is going to inspire like 45 other people in the LEC to start playing it. So good for Photon. Him being the better player to Broken Blade means that now teams will pick trap picks, and good for him. You know, really happy to see that. Perks was better than Caps. You always love to see Caps versus Perks. You know, it's the historic matchup in the mid lane, probably the most fun one to watch in the entire league. Perks definitely got the better of him in this one. He looked a lot better on that Cassio into the Ryze, in my opinion. One of the best counter picks in the game right now. Ryze is incredibly strong, and we've seen a lot of teams just elect to ban it out instead of actually trying to play into it. Perks, on the other hand, just decided, screw it, I'm going to go with the Cassio, I'm going to counterpick it, and I'm going to win, and there's not really a lot that the enemy team, that G2 and Caps in particular, can do about that. Big credit to these 3. They are the lifeblood. They are the river that Vitality runs through, and that probably will continue for the rest of the season. They are fantastic. Credit to Neon and Kaiser as well. They certainly don't make mistakes down in the bot lane, but they are so low resource as a bot lane that it's almost funny to watch. This is really a topside show for Vitality. As for G2, on the other hand, frustrating game. I think this really does expose some of the cracks in the armor that the Samurai has right now. When the bot lane doesn't win early, they don't particularly play the mid game all that well. They don't really know who to play around in the mid game, and that is apparent. Yike does not have any clue how to play from neutral or from, most specifically, behind in the mid game, and that is something that is pretty easy to learn at an LEC level. He knows where he needs to be and where his enemy jungler probably will be, but he doesn't know exactly what advantages he has available to him on the map. It is not typical for you to want to take 3v3s super often when you're losing, because you're just not going to win them a lot, especially when you're Udyr, Lucian, Nami, and you're just not going to be able to pick up a lot of those. And that's kind of what happened here for G2, is Yike just constantly felt like he was forcing plays that would have worked if he was up in gold, but he wasn't up in gold, so they didn't work. Obviously, Broken Blade and Caps also made some pretty big errors. Caps, most notably, basically just ran it down in the mid lane and just died. Sometimes it's going to happen. You know, Caps is going to make some aggressive plays that don't always work out. He's actually going to get my dud of the game here. I don't think he was all that useful on the Rise. I think that pick getting countered by Cassio was problematic. Him losing hard in lane and then not being able to transition to being any sort of split push threat towards the back half of the game, along with Udyr and, you know, the Lucian Nami really not translating as well, really gave them no team fight presence. And I think that was very much a problem for G2, but generally speaking, I think this is more of a team loss for G2 than any one particular player. While Caps does get the dud of the game, Hansama and Mickey did lose bot lane, even with no jungle assistance. Yike got completely out-jungled by Bo, which is what happens when Bo is able to get that gigantic lead, and then Broken Blade was just not on the same level as Photon. This was really just a team loss, in my opinion, for G2, and I think outlook-wise, it's not super concerning, but it does raise some questions. Like, this team doesn't just want to be top 4, they want to win the league, and I think they should be top 4, and they probably will be top 4, but can they beat Vitality? Like, could I see a world in which this kind of flips to the other side? You know, yes, I think if they have a better early game, especially if Hans and Mickey can get ahead in the bot lane, perhaps if they get some of their more signature picks. Obviously, the Draven was banned out, but they're good on a lot of other things as well. Perhaps if Hans and Mickey can generate that lead in the bot lane, Yike can get that map to work around, can get that freedom to be able to play a little bit more aggressive. I think G2 is going to be in a good spot, but it does kind of feel like G2 does rely on that early aggression in order for them to win a lot of these games. As for Vitality, it just feels like they can do whatever they want. The hands difference between Photon, Bo, and Perks and everybody else in the league feels like a massive gap right now. They are on the same page, they are ridiculously talented, and they are very, very scary. They are going to play you aggressive, they are going to play you tough, and they are going to dominate you. You just have to be ready to take it in and kind of distribute that if you can, like SK did. But they are going to be a team that a lot of teams globally, let alone in the LEC, are going to have trouble figuring out and finding ways to beat because of their explosiveness. And I think that is only a compliment towards how good this Vitality team has turned out to be. That's going to bring us to our final game here of day 3, our final game of the week here in the LEC. These videos are always the longest, maybe even including the LPL videos. They are pretty ludicrously long, but we get to the final game here, and it was between Fnatic and Team Heretics. And Heretics pick up another win here. Fnatic continues their slide down the standings and honestly down the expectation ranking, because this team is just not showing anything right now. We will get to that in a bit, but let's go with Heretics first and foremost. This was Fnatic's game to win, and Heretics did a good job keeping themselves in it, but Fnatic lost this game more than Heretics won. While they did make some really good plays towards the back half of the game, it's worth noting their early game here was very bad, and that's honestly what I was most concerned about when it came to Jankos joining this team. Is I think an underrated part of Jankos is his ability to play from behind. I think he is easily the best jungler in Europe when it comes to playing from a deficit. But the reason I feel so confident in that is because he actually did it more often than you would think on G2. He was someone who didn't particularly have fantastic early games consistently, even when he was on really good teams. And I was worried that that was going to translate a little bit here to Heretics, and that kind of did in this game. He was just outpathed early on by Razork, who was able to create a lot of pressure, and a lot of that came on the top side, where Wunder was actually playing really well on this Gwen pick, a pick that I've criticized a bit, but honestly, it looked really good for Wunder in the early game here, and Fnatic was able to generate their lead. However, all of that disintegrated in the late game with some really good team fights from Heretics. You know, credit to Evie and also credit to Jack Spectra. Those are the two players that I think I really want to point out on the side of Heretics who played this game really well. Player of the game for me is going to go to Evie in the top lane on the Cassante because of his willingness to go in and really just brutalize Fnatic in a lot of these team fights. I know a lot of people are talking about how Evie has only played Cassante in all 6 of his games so far in the LEC. We know he is not, a champion-dependent player. He is someone who does have a lot of opportunity to bring out some of these crazy weird picks like he has in the past, obviously in the LJL. So I'm not going to sit here and say that he's a one-trick or anything, but clearly K'Sante is working for him, and it continues to work for him as he plays this late game really, really well on this champion. He made Reckless and Humanoid's job so much harder on the backline. I think without Evie, Team Heretics just does not win this game. But I think you could say very similar thing about Jack Spectra in that final team fight. He gets Vi ulted. That's the point of Vi. You drafted in Azeri because you can Vi ult, and then Jack just outplays it into oblivion. Perfect positioning, perfect kiting. He's able to get Razork off of him, and he's able to do a ridiculous amount of damage in the team fights. This is what I wanted to see out of Jack Spectra going into the year. Obviously, a super hype prospect, has had some ups, has had some downs in the LEC so far, but this was a really good performance. His laning phase wasn't perfect. I will argue that Reckless just outplayed him early on in the game, but Jack made such a crucial play on a very crucial champion late in the game that I gotta give him credit. It was Evie and Jack that really shined. Shined? You know what I'm saying, to me in this game. Credit to Mersa as well on the Braum. A lot of responsibility for him to be able to peel for the Zeri, and he did in that last team fight. So really, really good from him. But Evie is going to be my player of the game. On the other side of this, you've got Fnatic who just continues to freefall. We were just talking about this in the previous section where it was like, oh, if Fnatic can get their early games together, maybe they'll be a team that was closer to what they were in the playoffs last year. Well, they got their early game together. They looked really good early on. Razork had good pathing. Wunder was ahead. Reckless was ahead. Everybody was looking good. And then it slowly just started to devolve. And I don't know, man. Fnatic just looks like they will not be able to play one completely good game this entire year. I don't know what to tell you. It's either the early game or the late game. They will always struggle in one of them, and it is super frustrating to watch as someone who wants to see this Fnatic team do well. Reckless and Rux played relatively good in this game. I actually thought they were winning early against Jack Spectra and Mersa, and they did a decent job of trying to translate that into a late game, but unfortunately K'Sante was problematic for Varus to have to try and break through. But it was a pretty easy choice for dud of the game for me in this one. It's going to go to Razork in the jungle. I talked about how his pathing early was good. His late game impact was bad. I don't really know what else to say when it comes to that. He was ulting the wrong targets. He was going in and immediately getting blown up. This is the problem with the Vi pick, and it's the reason that I don't recommend it to a lot of these teams. It's because I do think while Vi can be an incredibly explosive pick that gives you a lot of options, especially in the mid to early game, like we saw Bo just use it as in the Vitality game, I think it can also be something that goes in and just dies and loses you the fight, like pretty much immediately, which is kind of what Razork did in a lot of these games. He was going in, his team was clearly not ready to back him up, and he was just dying, and then it was a 4v5 that they could not win, and Fnatic was just kind of doomed from there. A lot of the problems that I'm worried about when it comes to Fnatic come in the form of cohesion. I think this team is very much lacking cohesion. They're very much lacking a distinct way that they want to play the game. It doesn't feel like Humanoid is on the same page as anybody on the team. Razork is not on the same page as Reckless. Wunder's not on the same page as Rux, whatever, right? Like, none of them are on the same page right now, and it's worrying because that is a problem that I think needs to be fixed in order for them to win games. Like, that's not a skill issue. That is them actively failing to be able to communicate with each other. I think they have a bad read on the meta. I think they are bad in communication. And I think it's really making their impact on both the early and the late game in terms of the plays that they want to make. And so, a lot of things that I think Fnatic really needs to fix, but honestly, they're in freefall mode right now. They were able to beat Koi in week 1, yes, but their other win was against Excel in a game that they should have lost, quite frankly, against a team that is also spiraling, arguably even worse than they are, and that's just not a good look. I think Fnatic right now is barely looking like a top 8 team, and that is about as disastrous as you could possibly ask for when it comes to this roster. Something's got to give and something's got to change. As for Heretics, another solid win here. It puts them at 500, which I think is pretty good. This team is kind of just right in the middle. I think there are a lot of teams that are really overperforming expectations, teams like BDS, teams like SK Gaming, and then you've got teams super underperforming, teams like Fnatic, teams like Excel. I think Heretics is right in the middle. They are a team that is good, but maybe not good enough to really be, like, competing with some of the best teams in the league. I think they have a lot of upside. I think Evie is a really strong player. I think Yankos is incredibly consistent at being able to get the team into the right spots, especially towards the back half of the game. And Ruby and Jack Spectra as players have shown flashes of being really good carries at this level. Mersa I loved last year, and I think he is a positive influence on the team. I just don't know if they have the upside that some of these other teams that have, kind of surpassed them, at least in my opinion, in terms of power rankings, have, right? They haven't shown the same things that BDS or SK have, at least in terms of consistency and being able to compete and beat some of the top teams in the region. But Heretics, for their credit, are still a competitive team. They're still good, and this win will likely put them in a spot where as long as they don't completely choke it away in the final week, they should be able to make top 8. All right, that is going to do it for my LEC Week 2 overview and analysis. Up on your screen right now, you're going to see the updated LEC standings. Of course, any ties are just going to be listed in alphabetical order. On the first column to your right, you're going to see my updated power rankings. This column next to that, you're going to see how that has changed from last week. So let's go over the biggest risers and the biggest fallers. Well, biggest risers this week should be no surprise to a lot of people. SK Gaming and BDS going up to number 4 and 5 respectively. They are legitimate top 6 teams right now, and BDS genuinely, like those two, might actually compete to be top 4 by the end of the split. That is how ridiculous we are in winter right now. Both of them look really solid and a lot more consistent than a lot of the other teams. Adam himself showed to be a superstar. SK Gaming as a unit just looks really solid. Both of them, no surprise, to be the biggest risers this week. Other risers, Mad Lions jumping up from number 4 to number 3. I think that is well-deserved, even though they weren't able to take down BDS. I think they had a good week. And then Vitality jumping up to number 1. They were able to beat G2, and so they swapped G2 down to number 2. Biggest fallers this week, again, no surprises. Excel is going to be the biggest faller. They dropped down to number 9. That shouldn't be a surprise to literally anybody. The fact that they're not number 10 is honestly grace from me. I think that right now they look like the worst team in the league, but they shouldn't be. And so for me, I'm going to stick them at number 9. They should be better than Astralis, but right now I just don't see them being able to make that cut outside of the top 8. And then Fnatic dropping 2 down to number 8. Koi dropping 3 down to number 6. Both also having very, very bad weeks overall. Both, really not winning any games. I mean, Fnatic won a game, but not really. You know what I mean? Excel lost the game more than Fnatic won it. Heretics, ironically enough, not moving. They're sticking right in that number 7 spot where I think they will be for the rest of the season, it will seem. But that brings us on to our player of the week and our dud of the week here. My player of the week, no surprise with how I've talked about this week so far, is going to go to Adam on BDS. He was fantastic over the course of this week, playing his things, the Olaf, the Darius. That's what I want to see out of Adam. I want to see him get the picks that he is known for and be able to beat a lot of these meta picks on them. I think that's exactly what I think a lot of teams really should be doing, is going to the playstyle that fits them the most. BDS have really capitalized on that, and Adam in particular looked fantastic this week. So he's going to be my player of the week here in week number 2. My dud of the week, unfortunately, is going to go to Comp on Koi. I think he was the player that underperformed the most for me in week number 2. I think you could give this to basically anybody on Excel, basically anybody on Fnatic, but for me, Comp definitely deserved it on Koi as well. I mean, his inability to play in lane over the course of this week really caused Koi's 0-3. I mean, that team is so dependent on that bot lane winning, and Comp playing so bad this week really caused that team to skyrocket down the standings, and I think that was a little bit of a problem. So Comp is going to be my dud of the week. Adam is going to be my player of the week, but that's gonna do it. I hope you guys did enjoy this video. Of course, this one is the longest and the most difficult one to make in terms of what we do here. So if you did enjoy it, please go ahead and leave a like. It really does mean a lot to the channel. Of course, let me know down in the comment section below, who am I overrating? Who am I underrating? What team is too high? What team is too low? And what game are you most looking forward to in the final week of LEC next week, or at least in terms of the winter split here? I'm really interested to hear you guys' opinions on that. But of course, with all that being said, I hope you all are having a great day. I hope you continue to have a great day, and I will see you all later.